Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History for Deep Rest. Tonight we step out onto a narrow wooden ship as winter closes its fist around the North Atlantic. The sea is iron grey, the sky low and heavy, and the wind feels like it has teeth. You stand barefoot for a moment on plank timber stiff with frost, and you quickly realise something important. There is no hearth here, no glowing stove, no cosy cabin humming with heat. Just open deck wool and whatever stubbornness you brought with you. You probably will not survive this. At least not comfortably. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you are in the world and what your local time is right now. I love imagining this strange little flotilla of listeners drifting off together across time zones. Now dim the lights and feel the cold settle in. You are standing aboard a Viking longship in the depth of winter. The shoreline of Scandinavia fades behind you, snow pressed into the creases of dark pines. Ahead lies open water flecked with ice. The first thing you notice is the absence of shelter. The ship is long and lean, built for speed and flexibility, not for comfort. There is no enclosed deck house, no chimney, no brazier glowing bravely in the corner. Open flames aboard a wooden vessel coated in tar would be a disaster waiting to happen. That is not dramatic storytelling. It is practical reality. One widely accepted historical fact is that Viking longships were open vessels without permanent heating systems, designed primarily for swift travel raiding and trade along coasts and across seas. Their construction prioritized speed and shallow draft over insulation. You feel that design choice immediately as the wind sweeps unhindered across the deck, finding every gap in your clothing. The hull rises beside you in overlapping planks clinker-built fastened with iron rivets. The wood creaks softly as the ship flexes against the swell. That flexibility is deliberate. It allows the vessel to ride waves instead of breaking against them. But it also means that cold seeps in from every direction. Beneath your boots, the boards are damp with spray. Your breath escapes invisible clouds. Someone beside you pulls their wool cloak tighter and says nothing. Words would only drift away in the wind. You glance at the row of shields hung along the gunwale. They offer some protection from waves, acting as a kind of makeshift barrier. In calmer weather, a tent-like awning might be rigged over part of the deck using a sail. In winter, that fabric stiffens, snaps and gathers frost. It helps, but only a little. You're not in a floating cabin. You're in a wooden skeleton skimming over frozen water. There is a curious tidbit preserved in later sagas that some crews would sometimes carry small soapstone containers with embers when near shore, carefully managed and extinguished before sailing into rougher waters. Whether this was common practice is uncertain, but it hints at a simple truth. Fire was precious, fire was dangerous, and fire on a longship at sea was usually avoided. As the coastline disappears, you feel something else creep in. Not just cold, but exposure. On land, winter can be negotiated. You build walls, pile peat on flames, retreat indoors. Out here, there is nowhere to retreat to. The sky arches above you like a lid of steel. The ocean slaps and hisses. Salt spray clings to your beard to your eyelashes, begins to freeze in tiny crystals. You wipe your face and your fingers ache immediately. Scholars still argue whether Vikings commonly undertook long ocean voyages in the harshest winter months, or whether most major expeditions were timed to avoid the worst cold. Archaeological evidence and saga accounts suggest both patterns at different times. Trade might push you out earlier than comfort would advise. Raiding might take advantage of surprise. Settlement voyages toward Iceland or Greenland could not always wait for perfect weather. So here you are. You shift your weight as the ship rocks. The crew around you moves with practiced balance. They have done this before. Their survival does not rely on heating systems or modern insulation. It depends on preparation clothing, food, teamwork, and a tolerance for discomfort that borders on the heroic. The sail above you snaps in the wind-striped wool stretched tight. When the wind fails, you will row. Rowing is not only propulsion, it is warmth. It is survival through movement. But for now, you stand and watch the horizon blur into a pale haze. The sun hangs low even at midday, barely climbing, before slipping back toward darkness. Winter shortens your world. There is a smell that clings to everything. Salt, wet wool, tar from the seams of the ship. A faint tang of dried fish from provisions stored in chests. It is not unpleasant, but it is persistent. Your senses sharpen in the cold. Every creak sounds louder. Every gust feels personal. Cold is not just around you. It presses against you, testing the edges of your endurance. You realize that surviving this voyage is less about conquering the elements and more about enduring them hour after hour. A man near the stern adjusts the steering oar. His movements are steady, economical. Leadership here is quiet. There is no grand speech about bravery. There is simply the shared understanding that everyone must function. If one person falters, others must compensate. The cold punishes weakness without ceremony. You crouch slightly as a wave breaks against the hull, sending icy spray across the deck. It stings your cheek like a scatter of needles. Someone laughs short and sharp, humour even here, especially here. The light begins to fade sooner than you expect. Winter evenings arrive abruptly, as if someone has drawn a heavy curtain across the sky. There will be no roaring fireplace to gather around. Instead, you will huddle closer together, share cloaks, turn your backs to the wind, and trust that your preparation is enough. You inhale, slowly feeling the air burn in your lungs. No heating, no glowing coals, just timber wool and human breath rising into the freezing dark. And somehow, against all odds, this is how you begin. The ship moves beneath you like a living thing, bending and easing with each swell, and you begin to understand that its very shape is part of your defense against the cold. It does not trap warmth, no, but it survives the sea that delivers the cold in the first place. You run your palm along the inner curve of the hull and feel the subtle ridges where plank overlaps plank. The construction is deliberate, almost elegant in its simplicity. A firmly established detail of Viking shipbuilding is that longships were clinker-built, meaning each oak plank overlapped the one below it and was fastened with iron rivets. This method created a hull that was both light and flexible. In winter waters, flexibility is not just convenient, it is life-saving. A rigid vessel meeting icy waves might crack. This one yields slightly, absorbing the shock. You feel that give in the boards under your boots, a faint spring that reminds you the ship is working with the sea rather than against it. The draft is shallow, so shallow that in calmer seasons you could run the ship up onto a beach. In winter, that same quality allows you to seek refuge in narrow inlets and fjords where deeper ships would hesitate. You imagine steering toward a snow-lined shoreline, the prow cutting through the thin sheets of ice. The ability to approach land easily means you are never entirely committed to the open ocean. You have options, and in the cold options are warmth. There is no bulky superstructure rising above you. No heavy cabins to catch wind or add weight. The low profile reduces exposure to gales. When a winter storm lashes across the sea, less surface area means less force pushing you sideways. You crouch instinctively as a gust sweeps over the deck, but the ship does not heel dramatically. It slices forward narrow and intent. Some maritime historians propose that the very curvature of the hull, combined with the symmetrical bow and stern, allowed these ships to reverse direction quickly, without turning fully around. In frigid conditions where manoeuvring among ice floes might be necessary, that agility could mean the difference between glancing off a hazard and colliding with it. You imagine the helmsman calling out the rowers, shifting the vessel, gliding backward as easily as forward. A curious aside appears in a few medieval sources describing how shipbuilders sometimes tested hull strength by flexing sections deliberately before launch. Whether that ritual was practical or symbolic is still debated, but it suggests an awareness of resilience as a defining trait. You picture craftsmen pressing against fresh timber, listening for the right kind of creak. Not a crack, never a crack, just that low wooden murmur that says the ship will bend and survive. In winter, water intrusion would be doubly dangerous. It would not only weigh the ship down, but freeze along seams, widening gaps. Maintenance is constant. You see a crew member crouch near the side checking a rivet head, tapping it lightly. Vigilance is warmth in another form. Scholars continue to discuss how often longships were modified for extended voyages into harsher climates such as the crossings toward Iceland and Greenland. Some argue that additional decking or temporary shelters were more common than the archaeological record clearly shows. Others believe that crews relied mostly on portable solutions like tents and piled gear. As you stand here with wind pressing against your cloak, you sense the truth may lie somewhere between ingenuity and necessity. The mast rises from the centre of the deck, solid yet removable. In heavy weather, it can be lowered quickly, reducing strain on the hull. You imagine the coordinated effort required, ropes hauled by stiff fingers, the mast eased down while waves slap against the sides. The design anticipates danger. It expects you to meet it. You glance towards the prow where the carved head, perhaps a dragon or serpent, juts forward. In the summer light it might look fierce. In winter dusk it looks almost solemn. These figureheads were sometimes removed when approaching friendly shores, perhaps to avoid frightening protective spirits. Whether that belief was universal remains uncertain, but it reveals something about mindset. The ship is not merely wood. It carries symbolism, identity, maybe even protection in the minds of those aboard. You kneel and press your ear briefly to the deck. The sea hums beneath a low, continuous vibration. The hull answers with soft knocks and sighs as waves strike and release. It is not a silent experience. The cold amplifies sound. Every creak feels closer to your bones. Water splashes over the side again, scattering droplets that freeze into a thin crust along the edge. Because the ship rides relatively low, spray is unavoidable. Shields hung along the gunwale help deflect some of it. They form a colourful barrier in fairer seasons. Now they are rimmed with frost, their painted surfaces dulled by ice. Even so, they serve as practical splash guards. You shift your stance, grateful that the planks are slightly curved rather than flat. That curvature channels water towards the centre where it can be bailed away. You see a man lifting a wooden bucket, tossing out slush before it accumulates. Small actions prevent larger problems. That seems to be the unspoken philosophy here. The open nature of the longship might seem like a flaw to a modern mind accustomed to heated cabins, yet enclosure would add weight and reduce flexibility. It would also trap moisture from breath and wet clothing, creating a damp chill that lingers. Out here, the wind scours everything clean. It steals warmth, yes, but it also prevents stagnation. You begin to realize that survival in brutal winter seas is not about resisting the environment completely. It is about designing something that moves within it efficiently. The longship does not try to be a floating house. It remains a tool, lean and responsive. Your comfort is secondary to its performance. As darkness deepens, you run your hand once more along the hull. The wood is cold, almost metallic in its chill, yet alive with subtle motion. You trust it because you must. Without heating, without walls, your survival depends on this narrow band of oak and iron riding the freezing water. The ship flexes again, steady and sure, and you breathe out slowly, letting that rhythm settle into you. The cold is no longer a distant concept. It is intimate now. It slides under your collar, brushes your wrist, seeps through the seams of your boots. So you turn your attention to the one barrier you truly control, what you wear. You begin with linen closest to your skin, surprisingly soft despite its simplicity. Linen wicks moisture away, and in a world without synthetic fabrics, that small detail matters enormously. Over that comes wool, thick, scratchy, dependable wool. A broadly accepted fact among textile historians is that wool was the backbone of Scandinavian clothing in the Viking Age, valued for its ability to retain warmth even when damp. You feel that quality as spray settles on your sleeve. The fabric darkens but does not immediately surrender its heat. Layer upon layer builds a kind of portable shelter. A tunic belted at the waist, trousers bound tightly at the calf to keep wind from funneling upward. A cloak fastened with a brooch at your shoulder, heavy enough to double as bedding at night. You pull the cloak around you now and it feels almost like a second skin. Not elegant perhaps, but effective. There is a faint animal scent clinging to everything. Wool never quite forgets the sheep. Fur linings, if you are fortunate enough to have them, carry a deeper musk. Fox sheep, maybe even reindeer, depending on your region and status. These materials are not decorative. They are survival distilled into fibres and hide. A lesser-known detail preserved in textile finds is that some Viking garments were carefully fulled, a process that thickened and tightened the weave of wool to make it more wind-resistant. You imagine hands plunging cloth into water, beating to it rhythmically to felt the fibres together. The result is denser, warmer, almost armour against the air. That quiet craft back on land now shields you from this merciless breeze. You tug a knitted cap lower over your ears. Evidence from fragments and later depictions suggests that head coverings were common, and it makes sense. Heat escapes from the head quickly. You can feel it when you remove the cap for even a moment. The wind finds your scalp instantly, as if delighted by fresh territory. Your boots are leather thick, but not entirely waterproof. Inside, perhaps you have wrapped your feet in woolen footcloths rather than socks. They can be adjusted, dried, rewrapped. Flexibility again. The deck is cold enough that you sense it through the soles, yet your toes remain tolerably warm as long as you keep moving. Historians still debate how standardized Viking clothing truly was across different regions and social classes. Some argue that surviving textile fragments suggest more variety and colour than popular imagination allows. Others caution that what we have preserved may not represent everyday wear. As you glance around at your companions, you see muted earth tones. Browns, greys, faded reds. Bright dyes existed certainly, but winter travel is not a fashion parade. Your hands are your constant concern. Without them, you cannot robel, tie ropes, or grip weapons if necessary. Mittens are warmer than gloves because fingers share heat. You flex them now inside the wool, feeling the slight resistance of fabric stiffening at the edges where frost has begun to form. You tuck your hands briefly under your arms, trapping warmth against your ribs. The body becomes its own furnace when carefully managed. There is a curious anecdote mentioned in some sagas of warriors boasting about enduring cold with bare arms to display toughness. Whether exaggerated or not, it hints at cultural attitudes toward hardship. Endurance was admired, complaints were not. You glance at your own covered limbs and feel no urge to test your limits unnecessarily. Pride does not thaw frozen fingers. The cloak around you is versatile. During the day it shields you from wind. At night it becomes bedding. If snow begins to fall, it can be drawn over your head, entirely creating a small pocket of warmer air near your face. You try it now, pulling the edge across your mouth. Your breath warms the space slightly, and for a fleeting moment you feel almost comfortable. Moisture, however, is the hidden enemy. Wet clothing in freezing air is dangerous. You notice how crew members periodically shake out cloaks, adjust layers, ensure that trapped water does not linger. There is constant micromanagement of fabric. A tug here, a twist there, small movements that preserve dryness. You reflect on how different this is from modern insulated jackets stuffed with synthetic fibers. No zippers, no sealed seams, just layers and knowledge. You must understand how your garments behave in cold wind, how wool insulates even when damp, how leather stiffens when frozen and must be flexed to avoid cracking. The sail above you also wool bellies in the wind. It too is part of this textile ecosystem. It captures force and turns it into motion, sparing you some rowing and therefore conserving energy. You glance up and appreciate that the same sheep providing fleece for your cloak might also power your journey. Another gust sweeps across the deck. You lean into it, cloak snapping slightly behind you. The cold does not vanish, but it is blunted. Your body heat pools within layers trapped by fibers that have been spun, woven, and stitched with care. As twilight thickens, you settle closer to your companions. Cloaks overlap, shoulders press together. Fabric against fabric creates tiny shared spaces of warmth. You realize that clothing is not just individual armor. It is communal insulation when bodies draw near. You inhale, catching the scent of wool and salt and human breath mingling in the darkening air. The wind continues its relentless whisper, but you are wrapped now, encased in layers of craft and animal warmth. The sea may be iron cold yet between linen and wool, and third, you carry a small stubborn pocket of heat with you into the night. As darkness settles fully, the wind sharpens, and you discover that fabric alone is not enough. Wool slows the cold, yes, but it does not defeat it. What truly begins to matter now is proximity, the quiet, unglamorous mathematics of shared body heat. You shift closer to the others as the sail is lowered for the night. The mast creaks softly while ropes are secured with stiff fingers. There is no cabin to retreat into. Instead, a tent of sorts may be raised using the sail itself draped low across part of the deck to break the worst of the wind. It is not a sealed shelter. It is a compromise. The air still bites, but less directly. One well-documented aspect of life aboard longships is that crews slept in close quarters, often side by side along the deck or atop chests of supplies. Space was limited, and privacy was almost non-existent. That arrangement, inconvenient in many ways, becomes an advantage of sow. You lie down shoulder to shoulder with men who smell of salt leather and smoke carried from distant hearths back home. Cloaks overlap, knees tucked toward chests. The human body becomes a source of heat as tangible as any ember. You feel the warmth of the person beside you radiating through wool layers. At first it seems minor, but as minutes pass, a small pocket of tolerable air forms between your bodies and the fabric tent above. Breath rises and lingers, no longer whipped away instantly by the wind. Someone exhales slowly near your ear. The sound is steady, reassuring. There is an understated reality recognized by maritime historians is that survival in harsh climates often depended less on technology and more on cooperative behavior. You are experiencing that principle directly. Alone you would shiver violently. Together you create a fragile thermal refuge. A lesser-known anecdote appears in later Icelandic accounts describing how some crews arrange sleeping positions, strategically placing the strongest or most robust men along the outer edges where wind seeped in while younger or weaker members were shielded toward the centre. Whether this was common practice everywhere remains uncertain, yet it reveals a practical compassion shaped by necessity. Strength was not merely for battle, it was for buffering cold. You curl slightly inward, drawing your cloak tighter around your legs. Beneath you, the deck is hard, unyielding. Some sailors sleep atop bundled gear or spare sails for insulation. You slide your hand under your hip and feel a coiled rope stiff with frost, but better than bare wood. Every small barrier between you and the planks preserves a fraction of warmth. There is quiet conversation at first, murmured words about the day's sailing, speculation about tomorrow's weather. Then gradually voices taper off, not because comfort has arrived, but because exhaustion overrules discomfort. Rowing, bailing, adjusting, sail bracing against wind. All of it drains energy. Sleep comes not as luxury but as surrender. You notice how the group instinctively minimizes exposed skin. Hands are tucked beneath armpits, faces are turned inward towards shared warmth rather than outward into the night. Even beards rhymed with frost earlier now thaw slightly in the collected breath of the cluster. Researchers continue to explore how Viking crews structured social bonds during voyages, questioning whether kinship ties dominated or whether broader alliances held ships together. Lying here, pressed between two breathing bodies, you sense that trust is essential. You are vulnerable in sleep. The sea is indifferent. The cold is relentless. Only the people beside you provide immediate reassurance. The sail above rustles softly. It blocks some of the wind, though icy drafts still slip through gaps. You feel one now sliding along your neck, and you instinctively burrow deeper into your cloak. The movement causes a ripple through the group as others adjust. No one complains. These small shifts are expected, almost choreographed. Condensation gathers faintly on the inside of the sail where warm breath meets frigid air. Droplets form and occasionally fall cool against your cheek. It is a reminder that even shared warmth produces moisture, and moisture must be managed. If the fabric becomes too damp, it will chill you later. Survival here is a balance never absolute. There is something humbling about this closeness. Status fades in the dark. Chieftain or common-termed sailor, you are equally dependent on collective heat. Wealth cannot conjure a fireplace at sea. Rank does not repel frost. You listen to the rhythm of breathing around you. Inhale, exhale, a chorus of lungs working in unison. The sea beneath continues its low, constant murmur, but within this small huddle, there is a different soundscape. Fabric brushing softly. The faint grind of teeth as someone clenches against a draft. A quiet snore beginning at the edge of the group. Anthropologists sometimes note that communal sleeping arrangements were common in many pre-modern societies, not merely for space efficiency, but for warmth and security. What might feel crowded to modern sensibilities feels entirely logical here. You're not sacrificing comfort, you're generating it collectively. Your toes ache briefly, then settle as warmth from the person near your feet seeps through layered cloth. The cold does not disappear. It presses at the edges of your shared cocoon, patient and persistent. Yet inside this narrow ring of bodies there is resilience. You close your eyes and focus on that fragile equilibrium. Wind outside, breath inside, timber below, sail above, human heat threading through it all. And in that closeness, without a single spark of flame, you endure the winter night. Morning does not arrive with warmth. It arrives with stiffness. You wake to the faintest grey light filtering through the sail overhead, and for a moment you are unsure whether you slept at all. Your back protests as you shift. Your fingers feel thick as if they belong to someone else. When you lift your hand toward your face, you notice the fine crust of frost clinging to your beard and lashes. It sparkles briefly in the weak dawn before melting against your skin. Breath has been your ally through the night, but it is also a complication. In the cold, every exhale carries moisture. That moisture settles on wool, on wood, on hair. You brush your cloak and see tiny crystals scatter like dust. Managing dampness becomes as crucial as trapping heat. A practical reality acknowledged by climate historians is that in sub-zero maritime environments, moisture control can be more dangerous than temperature alone. Wet fabric loses insulating power rapidly once frozen. You feel that risk now as you flex your shoulders, testing whether your outer layer has stiffened. It has slightly. Not dangerously, but enough to remind you that warmth here is conditional. That shielded you through the night is damp, inside faint droplets lining its weave. A crew member reaches up and shakes it lightly, sending a fine mist outward where it freezes against the edge of the deck. There is a small ritual to mornings like this. Movement comes first, before food, before conversation. You must stir circulation back into your limbs. You stamp your boots against the planks. You roll your shoulders. You clench and unclench your hands inside wool mittens. The deck is slick with a thin glaze of ice where spray collected, and hardened overnight. Maritime archaeologists have pointed out that longships often carried simple wooden balers not only for water but for slush and ice removal. You see one now in use. A man crouches and scrapes at a frosted patch near the gunwale, pushing shards over the side. The sound is sharp and rhythmic. Ice is not allowed to linger. Left unchecked, it adds weight and creates hazards. A small but intriguing detail from saga literature describes how some sailors would deliberately keep their beards braided or bound during voyages, partly for practicality. Loose facial hair collects frost more easily. Whether this was common or symbolic is open to interpretation, yet you can imagine the logic. Anything that reduces exposed surface area helps. You inhale slowly and feel the cold sting your lungs. It is a clean sensation, almost metallic. You become aware of how your own breath contributes to the environment around you. If you pull your cloak too tightly over your mouth, moisture builds up and dampens the fabric. If you leave your face entirely uncovered, the wind bites more harshly. You find a balance, letting air circulate while shielding the worst of it. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how Viking crews balanced exposure with ventilation, especially when using temporary coverings like sails as tents. Too much enclosure traps moisture, too little invites wind. Standing here in the grey light, you sense that experience, not theory, dictated their choices. The first task after waking is often to check clothing. You open your cloak slightly and feel the inner layers, still warm, still mostly dry. Relief spreads through you. You reach down to adjust your footcloths, ensuring no dampness has crept in. Your toes wiggle into response, alive and grateful. Someone passes a small wooden comb across his beard, knocking loose frozen crystals. The act seems almost gentle, a moment of normalcy amid harsh conditions. Personal grooming is not vanity here. It prevents discomfort from escalating into distraction. You glance toward the horizon. The sea is calmer this morning, though thin streaks of ice drift at a distance. The sky is pale and washed out, as if colour itself has retreated for the season. Sound carries differently in the cold. The creak of timber seems sharper. The splash of a wave against the hull echoes longer. A crew member laughs softly as he exhales and watches the vapour plume outward. For a fleeting second, it resembles smoke from an invisible hearth. There is something almost playful in that illusion. You create ghostly clouds, with each breath a reminder that heat lives within you, even when the world feels frozen. Researchers studying cold weather expeditions often emphasize the importance of routine in maintaining morale. Here, routine means checking for frostbite, flexing limbs, scraping ice, adjusting garments. No grand speeches, just repetition. You rub your hands together and feel warmth return gradually, a slow tide rising through your fingers. The person beside you nudges your shoulder, pointing toward a patch of ice near your boot that you had not noticed. You scrape it away together. Cooperation again, quiet and practical. As the sun inches higher, weak though it is, you feel a faint lift in spirit. Light itself becomes a resource in winter. It does not warm much, but it reassures. You take another breath and watch it bloom into white mist before dissolving. Frost still rims the deck. Your cloak still smells faintly of salt and wool. The cold has not retreated. It simply waits for you to become careless. But you are not careless. You're alert to moisture, to breath, to the fragile balance between warmth and dampness. On this open ship without a single flame burning, survival begins with the simple act of managing the air that leaves your own lungs. Mid-morning. The cold settles into a steady mid-morning. The cold settles into a steady presence, no longer shocking but constant, like a stern companion who refuses to leave. Your body has been working since before dawn, flexing, scraping ice, adjusting sail. Now it asks for fuel. Heat, you realize, does not only come from outside layers or shared breath. It rises from within, from the slow burn of food transformed into motion and warmth. You kneel near a wooden chest as it is opened, the lid creaking softly. Inside are provisions that look unremarkable to a modern eye, yet they are nothing less than survival. A widely recognised feature of Viking diet during voyages was its reliance on preserved foods, particularly dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, and dairy products such as skyr or butter. Fresh supplies rarely lasted long at sea, especially in winter when fishing could be unpredictable. You take a strip of dried cod and feel its stiffness between your fingers. It smells faintly briny, a reminder of the waters you are crossing. You bite into it slowly. It is tough, almost stubborn, requiring patience. As you chew, warmth begins to stir in your jaw and your throat. The act of eating itself generates heat. Calories are not a concept you articulate here, yet you sense their power. Fat is precious. Butter wrapped carefully in cloth, perhaps stored in a wooden container, is passed around sparingly. You scoop a small portion and spread it onto a piece of hard flatbread. The richness coats your tongue. In cold climates, high-fat intake becomes a quiet ally. It burns slowly, feeding the furnace inside you. There is an understated truth acknowledged by nutritional historians that societies living in northern latitudes often develop diets dense in fat and protein not by accident but by necessity. You are living that pattern now. Lean fare would not sustain you through hours of rowing in freezing wind. A curious culinary detail appears in some saga references describing fermented shark or other preserved fish consumed in challenging conditions. Whether such foods were common aboard every longship remains uncertain, yet the broader pattern of fermentation as preservation is clear. You wrinkle your nose slightly at the thought. Strong flavours perhaps, but long-keeping. Water is drawn from a barrel, careful and measured. Even in winter, dehydration is a risk. Cold dulls thirst, yet the body still loses moisture through breath and exertion. You cup your hands around a wooden ladle and drink. The water is cold enough to make your teeth ache, but it steadies you. Some voyages also included ale, weak but nourishing. It provided not only hydration, but a small caloric boost. You imagine a cup passed between hands, the liquid dark and slightly sour. Alcohol might warm you briefly in sensation, though its effect on core temperature is complex. Experience rather than theory guides how much is consumed. There is an ongoing academic discussion about how frequently Viking crews supplemented their provisions with hunting or fishing during longer crossings. Some argue that winter seas limited such opportunities. Others point to evidence of fishing gear aboard ships suggesting flexibility. You glance over the side at the cold expanse and wonder what might be pulled from it today. As you finish your portion of dried fish, you feel the change gradually. It is subtle but real. Your stomach warms first, then your chest. The chill that lingered in your fingers eases slightly. Energy moves outward from your core like a quiet tide pushing back against the cold. You notice how conversation brightens during meals. Not loud or boisterous, but lighter. Someone makes a comment about the toughness of the fish, earning a low chuckle. Humour once again threads through hardship. A lesser-known tidbit recorded in some archaeological findings is the presence of small personal utensils, including wooden spoons carved with care. Even at sea, individuality expressed itself in these modest tools. You picture your own spoon smoothed by use, perhaps marked subtly to distinguish it from others. After eating, you do not lounge. The sea does not permit indulgence. Instead, the rowers take their places as wind slackens. You grasp an oar, the wood cool but manageable now that warmth circulates in your arms. Muscles engage, the repetitive motion begins. Rowing is labour, yes, but it is also a generator. With each pull, blood surges through your shoulders and down your back. Heat spreads. The cold air still bites your cheeks, yet beneath your layers you feel alive, almost comfortable. The rhythm of oars entering water creates a steady splash and a lift. Breath synchronizes with the movement. Inhale as the oar dips. Exhale as you pull. It is a kind of meditation, though no one calls it that. Food has become motion. Motion has become warmth. Warmth becomes endurance. You glance at the others along the bench. Faces are flushed now, not from frost, but from effort. Steam rises faintly from cloaks as exertion meets icy air. For a fleeting moment, the deck feels less hostile. Survival without heating does not mean absence of heat. It means generating it deliberately, guarding it carefully, feeding it consistently. You pull again on the oar and feel strengthen answer. The sea remains vast and cold, the horizon pale and distant. Yet inside you a steady flame burns, fueled by dried fish butter, bread, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward. And as the longship glides across winter water, you realize that your body itself is the hearth you carry with you. The sea looks deceptively pure in winter. Pale light glints off its surface, and the air feels sharp enough to polish your lungs. It would be easy to imagine that water is the least of your concerns surrounded, as you are by endless waves. Yet thirst creeps in quietly, especially when cold air steals moisture with every breath. You pause from rowing as a barrel is rolled carefully across the deck. It thuds gently against a chest and is steadied by two sets of hands. Water aboard a longship is never taken for granted. Despite sailing through an ocean, you cannot drink what surrounds you. Salt would only deepen dehydration, leaving your mouth dry and your thoughts sluggish. Maritime historians generally agree that Viking crews carried fresh water in wooden casks during voyages, replenishing whenever possible at rivers, springs, or coastal settlements. You dip a ladle into the barrel and watch the surface ripple. The water is cold, almost icy, but clear. You bring it to your lips slowly. It tastes faintly of wood and storage, yet it is precious. Cold dulls your sense of thirst, your lips chap. Your tongue feels thick, but you might not immediately recognize dehydration creeping closer. The body loses moisture through breath that turns to vapor in the air, through stows sweat beneath wool layers, even through the simple act of speaking and freezing wind. You must drink deliberately, not just when you crave it. Pack snow into a container and let it thaw. Pack snow into a container and let it thaw slowly against your body, but that process is inefficient and chills you further. You imagine tucking a small pouch of snow beneath your cloak and waiting for warmth to do its work. Practical perhaps in dire circumstances, yet hardly ideal. A lesser-known note from later Scandinavian accounts suggests that sailors sometimes relied on diluted ale or whey as supplementary fluids. Such drinks offered calories and were often safer than stagnant water on land. Whether this was common practice during long ocean crossings remains a subject of discussion among researchers, but the presence of drinking vessels in ship burials hints at varied liquid provisions. You glance at the horizon, noticing faint streaks of white where distant ice floats. The air feels almost dry despite the surrounding water. Your breath leaves your mouth in pale clouds that vanish quickly. You take another measured sip from the ladle and pass it to the man beside you. There is a continuing academic conversation about how crews balanced water storage with cargo capacity. Every barrel occupies space and adds weight. Too many reduce maneuverability, too few invite disaster. The calculations must have been careful based on distance season and expected stops. Standing here, you appreciate that these decisions were not abstract, they were life and death. You wipe your mouth with the back of your mitten and flex your jaw. The cold water has awakened you fully. Around you others drink in turn, each careful not to spill. Even a small loss matters. If a wave strikes unexpectedly and a barrel tip's precious supply could vanish across the deck and overboard. There is a curious practice mentioned in some northern traditions of using hollowed animal horns as drinking vessels at sea. Practical and durable, they fit easily into a belt or chest. You imagine lifting such a horn, polished, smooth feelings its curve against your palm. It connects you to the animal world that sustains you in so many ways, from wool to leather to bone tools. As the day progresses, the cold intensifies slightly with shifting wind. Your lips crack further, and you taste a faint trace of salt from earlier spray. You resist the urge to lick them repeatedly. Instead, you draw your cloak up to shield your face and conserve moisture. You notice how conversation remains sparse while rowing resumes. Talking wastes breath and moisture. Silence becomes efficient. The only steady sounds are the dip of oars and the hush of water along the hull. A man near the stern adjusts a barrel strap, ensuring it remains secure. Even in calm seas, shifting cargo can create imbalance. Water casks must be wedged carefully between chests and gear. Stability preserves not only the vessel but the contents that keep you alive. You reflect on how different this experience is from turning a tap in a warm kitchen. Here each swallow carries weight, each sip is accounted for, there is no excess, no luxury of waste. As afternoon light fades slightly, you take another measured drink. The cold water slides down your throat and settles in your stomach, joining the warmth from earlier food. Together they sustain you. Hydration feeds circulation. Circulation feeds heat. Heat feeds endurance. Without heating, without fire, survival rests on these quiet exchanges between body and environment. You drink not to quench thirst alone, but to maintain the steady internal balance that winter constantly tries to disrupt. The barrel is sealed, again secured with rope. You return to your place at the oar. Your hands grip wood that is chilled but manageable. Your breath steadies. The sea stretches outward, indifferent and vast. Yet within you, water flows, warmth circulates, and the journey continues. The wind slackens by late afternoon, not kindly but decisively, as if it has grown bored of helping you. The sail droops, the longship slows, the sea still moves beneath you, yet forward motion fades into a lazy drift. This is when the benches matter most. You lower yourself into position, fingers curling around the worn handle of your oar. The wood bears faint grooves from years of use. It fits your grip almost too well, as though countless hands before yours have shaped it into this precise familiarity. Rowing in winter is not merely about travel. It is about survival through exertion. Many maritime specialists emphasize that longships were engineered for dual propulsion, able to harness wind when available and muscle when not. In frigid conditions, that design feature becomes critical. You cannot afford to sit idle in cold air. Inactivity invites chill to settle deeper into bone. The call goes out low and steady. Oars dip in unison. The first pull is stiff, your shoulders protesting slightly after the brief rest. The second pull flows more easily. By the third, your breath has found a rhythm. Inhale as the blade slices into water. Exhale as you lean back and draw it through. The motion is repetitive, almost hypnotic. Muscles along your back and arms awaken, sending warmth outward in gradual waves. Blood courses faster through fingers that earlier felt clumsy. Your chest expands with each deep breath and heat builds from within. There is a practical truth acknowledged by those who study cold weather expeditions that sustained physical activity generates crucial body heat. Here that principle is not theoretical, it is immediate. Within minutes, the icy bite against your skin becomes more tolerable. The soundscape changes as well. The sea's hiss blends with the synchronized splash of oars. Wood knocks softly against rowlocks. A faint grunt escapes someone near the bow. It is not complaint. It is effort. You glance sideways at the man beside you. His beard is still rimmed faintly with frost, yet his cheeks flush with exertion. Steam rises subtly from damp wool where sweat meets cold air. That moisture must later be managed, but for now it signals life and warmth. A curious note appears in some saga narratives describing rowing contests held during calmer stretches of voyage where crews measured strength and stamina against one another. Whether those accounts reflect regular practice or literary embellishment remains uncertain, yet they suggest a culture that valued endurance at the oar. You imagine a friendly rivalry, even now subtle and unspoken, each man determined not to falter. The benches themselves are simple planks, sometimes removable to allow cargo space. You feel the narrow edge pressing against your thighs. There is no cushion, comfort is irrelevant. Stability matters more. Fewer rowers might be carried to conserve provisions requiring each individual to work harder. Others argue that larger crews provided flexibility in rotating shifts. As your arms burn pleasantly with effort, you sense that numbers would shape survival profoundly. The rhythm intensifies slightly as the helmsman adjusts course. Oars rise and fall in disciplined arcs. You feel the longship surge forward, slicing through thin ripples of forming ice with a quiet crackle. Your breathing grows deeper now. The cold air no longer stings as sharply. Instead, it feels crisp and clarifying. Each inhalation fuels muscle. Each exhalation releases a cloud that drifts behind you like smoke from an invisible forge. You become aware of how the shared exertion binds the crew together. There is no room for vanity in synchronized rowing. If one man falls out of rhythm, the harmony breaks. Cooperation is warmth extended through movement. Sweat begins to gather faintly at your hairline beneath the wool cap. You resist the urge to remove it. Overheating would be dangerous. Balance remains essential. Too much sweat trapped against skin can chill you later. So you moderate your effort, strong but steady. There is an understated observation among historians of seafaring societies that rowing songs or chants often accompanied long stretches of manual propulsion. Whether Viking crews sang regularly during winter voyages is debated, yet you can imagine low murmurs aligning breath and stroke. Even without melody, the cadence itself becomes a kind of song. The sea ahead glows faintly under a pale sun that refuses to climb higher. Your arms ache now, but the ache is productive. It signals circulation. It signals heat. When at last the call comes to ease, you lift your oar and rest it across your knees. Your chest rises and falls, steam curling upward. The cold rushes in slightly where movement has paused, but it cannot reclaim what you have generated so quickly. You flex your fingers and feel strength there. The deck beneath your boots seems less hostile. The air, though still sharp, no longer feels like an enemy pressing against you. It feels manageable, without stoves or braziers, without glowing embers tucked safely below deck. Your warmth depends on this choreography of muscle and will. The longship glides forward once more, propelled by human effort that doubles as insulation. You wipe your brow with the edge of your cloak and allow yourself a small private satisfaction. Out here on winter water, the oar is not just a tool of travel. It is your furnace. Evening approaches again, and with it comes a different kind of labour, not rowing. This time, not eating, not scraping ice from planks. This labour is quieter, colder in its own way. It is the watch. You notice the subtle shift in mood as daylight thins. The horizon blurs into a pale seam between sea and sky. The temperature dips almost imperceptibly at first, then more decisively. Muscles that were warm from rowing begin to cool. The crew reorganises without much discussion. Some settle under cloaks to rest. Others remain upright. You are among those who stay awake. Night watches aboard Viking ships were a practical necessity, especially in uncertain waters. This is not romantic exaggeration. Open sea offers no pause button. Drifting ice, shifting winds, sudden squalls all require alert eyes. Even near coastlines, unseen rocks or narrow inlets demand careful steering. Someone must remain vigilant while others sleep. You stand near the stern-gloved hands resting lightly on the rail. The wood is cold yet familiar now. The helmsman murmurs something low to you, nothing dramatic, just awareness. You scan the darkening expanse ahead. The sea at night in winter feels different. Sound carries farther. The slap of a wave against the hull echoes more sharply. Distant ice knocking together creates faint hollow taps. The wind slides across your face thinner and sharper than before. There is an understated historical understanding that watches were rotated regularly to prevent exhaustion from overtaking the crew. Fatigue in cold conditions can be dangerous. It dulls judgment and slows reaction time. You feel that truth in your own eyelids as they grow heavy despite your efforts. You shift your weight and stamp one foot lightly to maintain circulation. Movement remains essential. Standing still invites cold to creep upward from the soles of your boots. You flex your fingers inside wool mittens, careful not to let them stiffen. A small and curious detail appears in some medieval Scandinavian texts describing sailors using subtle physical cues to check on one another during night watch, such as tapping a shoulder or quietly exchanging brief phrases. Whether these gestures were formalized or simply instinctive is uncertain, yet you recognize the wisdom. Silence can hide weakness as easily as it hides danger. The stars emerge gradually pinpricks of white scattered across the vast black canopy. In winter, the sky often feels closer, sharper. You tilt your head upward, orienting yourself. Celestial navigation is not an abstract skill. It is part of survival. Knowing your direction in darkness steadies the mind as much as the vessel. Researchers continues to explore how consistently Viking sailors relied on stellar navigation during winter months when cloud cover could obscure the sky for days. Some argue that coastal landmarks were preferred whenever possible. Others emphasize the likely importance of experience passed orally through generations. Standing here, you sense that both instinct and observation intertwine. Your breath drifts outward in steady clouds. You draw your cloak tighter, letting it wrap around your shoulders like a quiet shield. The deck creaks beneath you as the ship adjusts to a small swell. Somewhere behind you, a sleeper shifts fabric rustling softly. The cold at night feels more intimate. Without the distraction of rowing or conversation, you notice every sensation. The slight numbness creeping into your nose, the faint sting along your cheekbones. You rub your face gently to restore warmth, careful not to scrape skin too harshly. There is no firelight to ward off the dark. The only illumination comes from stars and the faint glow of the moon rising low and pale. Shadows stretch long across the deck, transforming familiar shapes into silhouettes. Shields along the gunwale look like silent sentinels. You lean forward slightly, peering into the gloom. A patch of darker water catches your eye, just shadow perhaps, or a cluster of floating debris. You alert the helmsman quietly. He adjusts course a fraction. The ship responds smoothly, gliding past whatever obstacle might have been there. In that moment, you understand the importance of wakefulness. One distracted glance could mean collision. One missed shift in wind could push you off course. Vigilance is its own form of heat, keeping mind and body engaged. A low murmur of wind passes through the rigging. The mast hums faintly, a sound almost like distant singing. You find yourself listening closely, mapping each noise. Familiar creak, familiar splash. Anything unusual would stand out sharply. Anthropologists studying seafaring communities often remark on the deep trust required among crew members. During watch, that trust is palpable. Those sleeping rely entirely on you. You carry their safety in your alertness. Time moves slowly in the cold dark, minutes stretch. Your thoughts wander briefly toward land, toward hearths glowing safely inside timber halls. You allow the image for a second, then return your focus to the sea. Nostalgia can chill as much as wind if indulged too long. Finally, a hand touches your shoulder. Relief washes through you as another crew member takes your place. You nod once, no grand exchange required. Duty passes quietly from one to the next, faintly. As you close your eyes, you feel faintly. As you close your eyes, you feel gratitude not for heat, but for vigilance. Out here in a world without stoves or sheltered cabins, survival through the night depends on eyes that refuse to close too soon. And as sleep draws near, you know that somewhere beside you someone else now stands against the cold, watching the horizon with steady resolve. The wind returns without ceremony. You sense it before you see it, a subtle tightening in the sail, a low shift in the tone of the sea. The surface that had been almost polite in its movements begins to wrinkle and darken. The helmsman narrows his eyes toward the horizon where a smear of grey thickens into something more deliberate. Storm. There is no shelter to retreat into, no cabin door to shut against what is coming. You rise from your place instinctively, cloak snapping, as the first stronger gust sweeps across the deck. The air tastes sharper now, almost metallic, and carries a faint hint of distant snow. A fundamental truth recognized by maritime historians is that Viking longships were built low and light, which made them fast and maneuverable but also exposed in heavy weather. Their survival in storms depended less on bulk and more on skill. You feel that principle unfolding around you as orders are given calmly without panic. The sail is partially lowered, reducing strain. Ropes are secured with quick practiced movements. The mast groans softly as tension shifts. You grab hold of a line, fingers tightening despite the cold. The ship tilts slightly as a stronger gust presses against its side. Spray lashes over the gunwale. This time it is not playful. It strikes your face in cold sheets, stinging your skin. You blink rapidly, wiping water from your eyes before it can freeze along your lashes. There is an old seafaring technique sometimes described in saga literature, where crews angled their ships carefully to ride waves at a slant rather than meeting them head-on. Whether every storm was handled this way is debated, but the principle of working with the sea rather than challenging it outright appears consistently in accounts. You feel the helmsman adjust course now, the prow turning slightly to meet the swell more gracefully. Another gust hits stronger than the first. The deck shudders beneath your boots. You crouch instinctively, lowering your centre of gravity. Shields along the side rattle faintly. The sound is sharp and urgent. Scholars continue to examine how often Viking crews chose to beach their ships ahead of severe winter storms rather than face them at sea. Archaeological evidence suggests frequent coastal stops, yet unexpected weather would have made avoidance impossible at times. Standing here in rising wind, you sense that this may be one of those unavoidable moments. Water pools briefly near your feet before rushing toward the centre of the deck. Someone shouts and begins bailing immediately. You join in scooping slush and tossing it overboard. The motion keeps your arms warm even as wind slices at your back. The sky darkens unnaturally, fast clouds rolling in thick and heavy. Snow begins to fall, not in delicate flakes, but in hard pellets driven sideways. They strike your cloak and bounce away. Within minutes, a thin layer accumulates along the edges of the deck. There is a curious mention in a few medieval texts of sailors invoking protective words or small gestures toward carved figureheads during dangerous weather. Whether such rituals were widespread is uncertain, yet you catch yourself glancing toward the prow where the carved shape cuts through spray with a stoic indifference. Faith and seamanship intertwine easily when the sea grows loud. Another wave slams against the hull, sending a tremor through the planks. The longship flexes, bending slightly rather than resisting. That flexibility you noticed earlier becomes tangible reassurance. The wood creaks but does not crack. Your cloak grows heavier as spray soaks into outer fibres. Beneath wool continues to insulate, but you are acutely aware of the balance tipping toward dampness. You shift your stance to keep blood moving, refusing to stiffen. The crew works in coordinated bursts. One group manages the sail, another bails. Others remain ready at oars if needed to maintain angle and control. No one stands idle. Activity generates heat and keeps fear from settling too deeply. Researchers who study historical storm survival often note the psychological component. Panic spreads quickly in exposed environments. Calm leadership matters as much as construction. You observe the helmsman's steady posture, the measured tone of his commands. It anchors you more effectively than any physical barrier could. Snow thickens, briefly swirling around your face. You squint through it, focusing on the immediate tasks rather than the vast uncertainty beyond the bow. The world narrows to rope water wood breath. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the worst of the gusts begins to ease. The sail steadies. The angle of the ship levels slightly. Snow still falls but less violently. The sea remains restless yet no longer furious. You exhale deeply, realizing how tightly you had been holding tension in your shoulders. Your hands tremble faintly, not from fear but from exertion and cold combined. There is no cheering when the storm passes, only quiet adjustments. Lines are checked, water is bailed, cloaks are wrung gently where possible. The sail is raised again in cautious increments. The air feels colder now, stripped clean by the wind. Your cheeks burn slightly, yet you remain upright. The longship remains intact. Without a heated cabin to retreat into, without even a small protected nook, you have faced the storm directly relying on design coordination and endurance. As the sea settles into a heavy roll, you return to your place among the crew. Your clothing is damp but manageable. Your muscles hum with residual warmth from effort. The storm has reminded you of something simple and profound. Out here in winter's grip, survival is never about comfort. It is about staying engaged, staying balanced, and trusting Woodwool and one another to carry you through the worst that the cold sea can deliver. When the storm finally loosens its grip, it leaves behind a quieter danger. Ice. You notice it first along the edge of the gunwale, a thin glassy ridge catching the weak afternoon light. Then along the seams between planks where spray has settled and hardened. The sea still rolls beneath you, but the deck has transformed into something far less forgiving. You step carefully, testing your footing. The wood that once felt rough and familiar now carries a slick sheen. A misstep here could send you sliding into a bench, a chest, or worse, over the side into water that would steal breath instantly. A practical detail often highlighted by maritime researchers is that managing ice accumulation was an essential but unglamorous part of winter sailing in northern waters. Even small layers add weight and create instability. You see that truth plainly as the crew begins to scrape. Wooden tools come out first. Simple scrapers, perhaps even the back of an axe used carefully. You kneel and chip at a frozen patch near your boot. The ice resists at first, clinging stubbornly to the grain of the wood. Then it cracks, breaking away in brittle shards that scatter across the deck before being swept aside. The sound is sharp and rhythmic, tap, scrape, crack. It echoes faintly in the cold air. You feel the vibration through your gloves, the impact travelling up your arms. It is tedious work, but necessary. If ice builds too thickly, it can shift the ship's balance. In extreme cases, historical accounts from later northern voyages describe vessels becoming dangerously top-heavy from accumulated ice. Whether Viking crews faced such extremes regularly is debated, yet even modest build-up demands attention. A small but intriguing observation from archaeological studies of ship remains suggests that wear patterns along deck planks indicate frequent scraping and maintenance. These marks preserved in timber hint at repeated efforts to keep surfaces clear. You're adding your own faint scratches now, part of a long tradition of quiet upkeep. Your breath fogs as you lean closer to your task. You brush aside loosened fragments with a gloved hand. They skitter across the deck and tumble over the side, disappearing into the sea with soft clicks. Someone near the bow loses footing briefly, boots sliding on an untreated patch. He catches himself against a shield and regains balance. A short laugh follows, edged with relief. No one mocks him, the risk is shared. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how Viking crews balance speed with safety during winter travel. Did they push onward despite hazardous deck conditions or pause frequently to manage ice? The answer likely varied. Standing here, you sense that caution prevails. A few extra minutes scraping is preferable to injury far from shore. You move toward the centre where slush has collected. Using a wooden baler, you scoop semi-frozen water and toss it overboard. The motion keeps your core engaged, generating warmth even as cold air brushes your neck. The shields lining the sides are rimmed with frost again. You knock gently along their lower edges, dislodging thin sheets that have formed from spray. Each shield, decorative in fair weather, becomes functional protection in storms and a surface for ice to gather afterward. There is something methodical about this work. The storm was loud and dramatic. This is quiet persistence. Survival often lies more in these small repetitive actions than in grand confrontations with nature. You notice how the deck's slight curvature helps channel meltwater toward the centre, where it can be removed more easily. That design choice, subtle yet intentional, reduces standing water that could freeze into treacherous ridges. A faint ache spreads across your knuckles as you continue scraping. You flex your fingers periodically to maintain circulation. The cold nips at exposed skin where your mitten shifts. You pull it tighter without pausing your rhythm. A curious anecdote appears in a later Norse text describing sailors using sand scattered lightly over icy surfaces to improve traction. Whether this practice was widespread or situational remains uncertain, yet you imagine a handful of coarse grit thrown across a slick patch boots finding better purchase. The sea remains restless but manageable now. The sky has cleared slightly, revealing a pale strip of sunlight low on the horizon. It glints off the ice shards at your feet, transforming them briefly into scattered jewels. You step back to inspect your work. The planks are rough again, grip restored. Not perfect, but safer. Around you, others finish similar tasks. The deck gradually returns to its familiar texture. In the absence of heating, in the absence of walls, you rely on vigilance not only against wind and waves, but against these quieter threats. Ice does not roar, it creeps, it accumulates silently until suddenly it matters. You straighten, slowly rolling your shoulders. Your body feels warmer from the exertion. The cold has not disappeared yet, it feels less dominant when you are active attentive. As the longship continues its steady progress through winter waters, you glance down once more at the cleared planks beneath your boots. Each scrape, each lifted shard, each careful step is a small act of defiance against the elements. And out here, where even the deck can betray you, that steady defiance keeps you upright. Night settles again, though this time without the violence of a storm. The sky is clear, sharp with stars, and the sea rolls in long, patient swells. The cold presses close, but something shifts in the air among the crew. The urgent tasks are done. Ice has been scraped, sails adjusted, water checked. For a brief stretch, there is space for something less tangible. You draw closer with the others beneath the low shelter of the sail. Cloaks overlap once more, knees tucked inward. The wind still slips through gaps, yet your bodies create a fragile island of warmth. Breath mingles, shoulders touch. In societies across the Viking world, oral storytelling played a central role in preserving memory and identity. This is not speculation, but a broadly accepted feature of Norse culture. Long before sagas were written down centuries later, tales travelled by voice. Genealogies, heroic exploits, cautionary myths. Words were vessels as vital as ships. You sense it now as one of the older men clears his throat quietly. His beard glints faintly in starlight. He begins not with a shout, but with a low measured cadence. The sound of his voice threads through the cold air steady as rowing strokes earlier in the day. He speaks of a journey across another sea of a chieftain who braved ice and found land where none was expected. You listen not merely for entertainment, but for warmth of another kind. The mind, when engaged, forgets the edge of wind for a while. There is an understated observation among cultural historians that shared narrative strengthens group cohesion in high-risk environments. Around you, heads tilt slightly inward. Even those half asleep remain attuned. The story is not background noise, it is binding, a small and curious detail recorded in Lo. In later Icelandic tradition, describes sailors reciting verses about summer meadows during winter voyages, deliberately invoking imagery of warmth and growth. Whether such deliberate contrast was common or poetic embellishment is uncertain, yet the idea makes sense. Memory can generate comfort, almost as effectively as wool. The storyteller pauses occasionally, letting the rhythm breathe. In those gaps you hear the sea again, the faint creak of timber, the distant cry of some unseen bird. Then his voice resumes, weaving gods and mortals together in the same fragile world. Researchers continue to debate how much of the surviving saga material reflects actual Viking Age practice versus later medieval reinterpretation. Sitting here in the cold dark, you do not concern yourself with textual layers. What matters is the effect. Laughter bubbles up softly at a humorous turn. Someone murmurs appreciation. You feel your own body relax slightly. Shoulders drop, the tension that clung after the storm loosens. Warmth circulates not only from proximity, but from attention directed away from discomfort. A younger crew member adds a brief anecdote of his own, perhaps exaggerated. It involves a boastful rival who underestimated a winter crossing. The punchline earns a few quiet chuckles. Even humour becomes insulation here, buffering against monotony and fear. The stars above seem brighter as the story unfolds. You glance upward briefly, imagining the constellations as characters in their own endless tale. The cold still bites your nose, but you are less aware of it. Anthropologists studying endurance in harsh climates often emphasize the role of morale in physical survival. Low spirits can sap energy as surely as frostbite. In this circle of murmured voices, morale rises subtly. You pull your cloak tighter, nestling deeper into shared warmth. The storyteller's voice lowers as he approaches the tale's end. There is no dramatic flourish, only a soft conclusion, a lesson perhaps about courage or cunning or fate. Silence follows, but it is not empty. It hums gently with residual connection. Someone shifts and adds a quiet observation about a landmark you may pass tomorrow if the wind holds. Practical talk resumes, blending seamlessly with myth. The boundary between story and strategy feels thin. A faint smile lingers on your lips as you close your eyes. The cold has not relented. There is no fire crackling nearby, yet the psychological heat of shared narrative lingers in your chest. Out here in a vessel without stoves or walls, warmth is crafted from many sources. Wool and muscle, bread and water, vigilance and skill, and now words. As sleep begins to tug at your awareness, you realize that while the sea may be vast and winter merciless, the circle of voices beneath this sagging sail forms something remarkably resilient. In the dark, wrapped in layered cloth and layered memory, you endure once more. When you wake again, the sky is unusually clear. The storm has scrubbed it clean, leaving a vast blue dome that feels almost brittle in its brightness. The air is colder than the night before, sharpened by clarity. You pull your cloak tighter and rise carefully, boots finding steadier footing on planks now mostly free of ice. Today direction matters. In winter, daylight is brief and precious. You cannot afford to waste it drifting uncertainly. The helmsman stands near the stern, eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in calculation. You follow his gaze upward. The sun hangs low even at mid-morning, tracing a shallow arc across the southern sky. In northern latitudes during winter, it never climbs high. His position becomes both guide and reminder of how far you are from warmth. It is widely acknowledged that Viking navigators relied on a combination of coastal landmarks, sun position stars, wind patterns, and accumulated experience rather than maps in the modern sense. Standing here, you see that navigation is not a single technique, but an intimate reading of the world. You watch as the helmsman studies the sun's angle, then glances toward the coastline faintly visible in the distance. Snow lines the dark cliffs, creating stark contrasts that are easier to recognize against the winter sea. Land is both friend and hazard. It offers refuge, but hidden rocks lurk beneath those pale edges. There is a fascinating object often mentioned in discussions of Norse navigation, sometimes called a sunstone. Some researchers suggest that certain crystals may have been used to detect the sun's position even through thin cloud cover by polarizing light. The evidence is intriguing, but not universally accepted. As you squint toward the sky, you imagine holding such a sort, rotating it until brightness aligns just so. Whether myth or method, the idea speaks to ingenuity. The wind shifts slightly, brushing your cheek from a new direction. You notice how the sail responds, filling unevenly. The helmsman makes a small adjustment to compensate. Every subtle change in air matters. Scholars continue to examine how Viking crews managed long open sea crossings during seasons when overcast skies obscured both sun and stars. Some argue that they hugged coastlines whenever possible in winter. Others believe that experience with ocean swells and bird patterns supplemented celestial cues. Watching the crew, you sense that knowledge here is layered, built from countless voyages. A seabird appears briefly overhead, its cry sharp against the quiet morning. It circles once, then veers toward a distant stretch of darker water. Birds often signal proximity to land or changes in current. You follow its path with quiet interest. The deck creaks gently as the ship rides a rolling swell. Your breath rises in faint clouds less dramatic than at night, but still visible. You adjust your stance to keep balance while keeping your eyes on the horizon. Navigation in winter is not only about direction, but about timing. With shorter days, miscalculations carry greater consequence. Darkness falls quickly, and without artificial light, coastal approaches become dangerous. You imagine arriving too late to identify a safe inlet, forced to remain offshore in cold wind through another night. A small but evocative detail preserved in some medieval sources describes sailors memorizing distinctive shapes of mountains and cliffs as if committing faces to memory. Landmarks become companions. You peer toward a jagged ridge ahead, wondering if someone aboard recognizes its outline. The sun edges slightly higher before beginning its gradual descent. You note how these shadows lengthen quickly, even though it feels like midday. Time compresses in winter. The helmsman exchanges a few quiet words with another experienced sailor. They point toward a gap between two snowy headlands. Perhaps a sheltered fjord lies beyond. You feel a flicker of cautious hope. Researchers studying early navigation often emphasize that certainty was rare. Routes were known, yes, but conditions altered perception. Fog snow shifting ice could distort familiar views. You sense that humility underlies every decision here. You move toward the side and lean slightly over, watching how the watercolor shifts subtly near shore. Lighter patches might indicate shallows. Darker bands might conceal depth. Your eyes scan, constantly absorbing patterns. The sail flutters briefly as wind wavers, then fills again. The ship adjusts course a fraction. Oars remain ready if needed. You feel the crew's quiet attentiveness sharpen as land draws nearer. There is no triumphant declaration of arrival, only careful calculation. If that gap between headlands proves navigable, you may find temporary refuge from the open sea. If not, you will continue onward. Without heated cabins, without compasses of polished brass, survival hinges on this dance between observation and instinct. You rely on sunbird shoreline wind. As afternoon wanes and the headlands loom closer, you feel gratitude for clear skies. In winter, clarity itself becomes a gift. The longship glides forward, guided not by glowing instruments, but by attentive eyes and inherited wisdom. And you stand among them, reading the world as it unfolds, knowing that in these cold waters, direction is as vital as warmth. The gap between the headlands widens as you approach, and with it comes a subtle shift in the air. The wind that had pressed steadily against your cloak softens, disrupted by cliffs that rise dark, and snow streaked on either side. The sea beneath the hull calms its surface, smoothing into long, gentle swells. Shelter. Not warmth exactly, but relief of heater. You feel the difference immediately in your shoulders. The constant lean into wind eases. Sound changes too. Waves no longer slap sharply against the hull. Instead, water laps in muted rhythms, echoing faintly off rock walls that cradle the inlet ahead. Inlets offered protection from open ocean. Inlets offered protection from open ocean conditions. Standing here as the longship glides inward, you grasp how crucial those havens must have been in winter. The helmsman guides the ship carefully between the cliffs. Snow clings to ledges high above. Icicles hang like glass teeth from overhangs. You glance upward and feel small in comparison to these silent stone guardians. The water darkens beneath you deeper and calmer. Someone lowers an oar briefly to gauge depth and stability. The motion is practiced unhurried. There is a quiet debate among maritime scholars about how frequently winter voyagers intentionally sought sheltered anchorages versus pressing on toward fixed destinations. Some argue that tight schedules for trade or raiding left little room for extended pauses. Others suggest that flexibility was built into such journeys, especially when weather turned harsh. As you drift farther into this natural harbour, you suspect pragmatism usually prevailed. A small rocky beach appears along the inner curve of the fjord. Snow blankets it in soft contours broken only by scattered stones and the dark line of water's edge. The longship is angled gently towards shore. One of the remarkable advantages of the longship's shallow draft becomes evident now. Unlike deeper vessels that must remain offshore, this ship can approach closely, even run lightly, aground without catastrophic consequence. The hull slides toward the pebbled beach with a soft grinding sound, more whisper than scrape. Men jump lightly into the shallows, boots splashing into icy water just deep enough to numb ankles. They guide the prow onto the shore and secure ropes around exposed rocks. The ship settles these at a slight angle stable. The sudden stillness feels almost surreal. After days of constant motion, the deck no longer shifts beneath your feet. You stand quietly for a moment, absorbing the absence of sway. A lesser-known detail from archaeological findings suggests that some Viking crews carried portable wooden frames or simple tent supports to create temporary shelters on land during stops. Whether such structures were erected on every occasion is uncertain, yet the evidence hints at adaptability. You imagine a sail stretched between poles on the beach, forming a windbreak. You step onto the shore cautiously. The snow compresses under your boots with a muted crunch. Cold radiates upward from the ground, different from the chill of sea spray. It feels drier, sharper. The crew moves efficiently. Some remain aboard to check ropes and inspect the hull for storm damage. Others gather driftwood scattered along the beach. Here at last, controlled fire becomes possible. On land with distance from tar-coated planks, flame is no longer forbidden. You watch as a small pit is cleared in the snowstones arranged carefully. A spark catches on dry tinder and a modest flame rises. It is not a roaring bonfire, but its glow feels almost miraculous after nights without open heat. Anthropologists studying Norse settlement patterns note that temporary camps likely accompanied many voyages, especially during exploration or trade missions. These brief pauses allowed repairs, rest, and recalibration. Standing near this flickering flame, you sense how essential such interludes must have been. You hold your hands toward the fire, cautiously aware that rapid warming after prolonged cold can sting painfully. Heat spreads gradually through your fingers. The sensation is almost overwhelming. Steam rises faintly from damp cloaks hung near but not too near the flames. The smell of wet wool mingles with the wood smoke, earthy and comforting. Someone sets a pot near the fire to warm water for a simple meal. The hiss of snow melting against heated stone punctuates the quiet. Yet even here vigilance remains. The fjord walls trap sound, but they also conceal potential threats. Eyes scan the tree line beyond the beach. The world feels secluded, but not necessarily empty. There is a continuing scholarly conversation about how often Viking voyages involved peaceful trade versus sudden conflict. In winter especially, encounters might be rarer yet more unpredictable. As you warm your hands, you remain alert. Still relief seeps into your bones. The constant battering wind has paused. The deck no longer needs scraping. For a few hours, perhaps through the night, you will rest with land beneath you. You look back at the longship drawn up along the shore. Its hull dark against snow seems almost to exhale. Timber that endured waves now rests quietly. Without permanent heating aboard, these sheltered stops become lifelines. They are not luxuries, but necessary punctuation in a sentence written across cold water. As twilight deepens within the fjord, firelight flickers against stone and wood. Shadows dance along the snow. And you stand there, hands extended toward a modest flame, grateful for this brief embrace of warmth before the sea calls you outward once again. By morning, the small fire has burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and frost has crept back over the edges of your cloak. The fjord lies quiet, a thin mist hovering above dark water. Snow along the shoreline reflects the pale light, making everything seem sharper, almost fragile. You kneel near your gear and begin the unglamorous work that keeps you alive at sea. Clothing maintenance. It may not sound heroic yet, it is as vital as steering or rowing. A torn seam, a sodden hem, a loose fastening can turn minor discomfort into dangerous exposure once you are back on open water. Textile historians have long noted that Viking garments were carefully constructed and frequently repaired rather than discarded. Wool was valuable. Cloth required time, skill, and labour. You feel that truth in your hands as you inspect your tunic, running fingers along the stitching near the shoulder. A thread has loosened slightly where the cloak clasp pulls. You sit on a flat stone and draw out a small needle from a pouch. Bone or bronze, simple yet precise. The thread is woolen, spun tightly. You work slowly, breath visible in faint clouds as you lean close to see clearly. There is a quiet satisfaction in this act. Each stitch is insurance against wind. Nearby, another crew member shakes out his cloak, beating it gently to dislodge lingering moisture before it stiffens again in cold air. Steam rises faintly where fabric meets morning sun. The smell of wool and smoke drifts between you. Researchers studying Viking-age textiles often remark on the durability of fulled wool fabrics which resist wind and retain warmth even after repeated wear, yet even the strongest cloth frays under salt spray and constant movement. Maintenance is relentless. A small but intriguing detail from archaeological finds in Scandinavian bogs reveals patches sewn carefully over worn areas, sometimes in contrasting colours. Function outweighed aesthetics. You glance at your own repaired seam and imagine it joining that long tradition of practical mending. Boots require equal attention. You sit and loosen the leather ties, checking the inner foot cloths. They are damp but not sun-soaked. You unwrap and rewrap them, adjusting folds to eliminate pressure points. A wrinkle in harlequin cloth can rub skin raw during hours of rowing. Blisters in winter are not merely painful, they compromise mobility. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how Viking sailors balanced the need to dry garments with the risk of overexposing them to heat or sparks from fires during shore stops. Too close to flame and wool can scorch, too far and dampness lingers. You see this balance in practice as cloaks hang at a careful distance from the remaining embers. You rise and hold your mittens near the warmth, briefly turning them so each side dries evenly. The leather palms soften slightly as frost melts. You flex your fingers inside, testing mobility. The sail too receives attention. Spread partially along the beach, it is inspected for tears inflicted by yesterday's storm. Fingers trace along seams, checking for strain. The sail is lifeblood at sea. A weakened section could fail at the worst moment. There is a quiet rhythm to this shared labour. No grand commands, just observation, repair, adjustment. Someone hums softly, perhaps a fragment to last night's story still lingering. The fjord remains still, a temporary sanctuary. Snow crunches under boots as men move between ship and shore. The longship itself is examined carefully. Rivets are tapped, tar seams inspected. A thin line of fresh resin may be applied where needed. Maritime archaeologists often highlight how proactive maintenance likely extended the lifespan of Viking vessels significantly. These ships were not disposable tools, they were investments of community labour and pride. You sense that reverence in the way hands move across timber. Your own cloak feels lighter, now drier. You pull it around your shoulders and test its weight. Comfortable, manageable. A curious note preserved in later Norse lore describes sailors marking subtle symbols on personal items before long voyages, perhaps as quiet tokens of protection. Whether widespread or individual habit is unclear, yet you glance at your brooch and wonder if it carries such unseen meaning. As the sun climbs slightly, though never high in winter, the decision to depart draws near. The fire is fully extinguished. Gear is packed. The sail is refurled and secured. You take one last look at the fjord walls rising around you. Snow gleams along ridges. The brief warmth of shore has done its work. Garments are dry, seams are strong, spirits steadied. Without heaters aboard, this careful tending of cloth and leather becomes a ritual of resilience. You're not simply dressing. You're fortifying yourself against the sea's unyielding cold. As the longship is eased back into deeper water and ropes cast off, you step aboard with renewed confidence. Your clothing rests comfortably against your skin, ready to face wind once more. The fjord recedes behind you, narrowing into a silver thread between cliffs. Open sea welcomes you back with a low open sea welcomes you back with a low rolling sigh. The longship resumes its familiar rhythm, prow lifting and settling, timber flexing in quiet response. Shore warmth already feels distant, like a brief dream. Night will come again, and with it the challenge of rest upon water. You watch as the crew begin subtle preparations long before dusk. Chests are shifted slightly to create flatter surfaces. Spare cloaks are shaken free of snow and folded within reach. Ropes are coiled neatly so they do not become hazards in darkness. There is nothing dramatic about this. It is simply understood that sleeping at sea requires intention. It is widely recognised by maritime historians that Viking longships lacked enclosed sleeping quarters during active voyages. Crew members rested on deck, often atop personal gear or under temporary coverings. Comfort was minimal, yet adaptation was constant. As daylight fades, the sail is adjusted into a low canopy once more. The fabric curves overhead secured tightly enough to break the worst of the wind without trapping too much moisture. You crouch beneath it, testing how the air feels. It is cooler than on shore, but not unbearable. You choose a spot along the deck near a chest of provisions. The wood beneath you is hard, yet slightly warmer than exposed planks due to insulation from stored goods. You lay your cloak down first, then settle atop it. Another layer drapes over you. Your boots remain on. Removing them would risk stiff leather and frozen laces by morning. There is a soft murmur among the crew as positions are negotiated wordlessly. Shoulders align, backs pressed lightly together. Space is limited, and every inch matters. Anthropological research into communal sleeping practices in pre-modern societies often highlights their dual role in warmth and security. Here both are evident. You feel safer in proximity, less isolated against the vast darkened sea. A faint crescent moon rises, casting silver light across the deck. It glints along shield rims and catches the curve of the mast. The sea beyond reflects it in broken fragments. A small yet intriguing detail from saga traditions mentions the use of feather-filled bedding among wealthier individuals even during travel. Whether such luxury accompanied winter voyages regularly is uncertain, yet you imagine how rare softness would feel here. Most of you rely on wool and whatever padding your gear provides. The cold intensifies gradually. You tuck your chin into the collar of your tunic, creating a pocket of warmer air. Your breath warms the space briefly before slipping outward. You adjust your position so that your back faces the windward side, letting others shield your front. There is an ongoing academic conversation about how well temporary sail coverings retained heat versus simply reducing direct wind exposure. Some scholars argue that the psychological comfort they provided was as important as their physical effect. Lying here now, you understand that even a slight reduction in wind transforms the experience. The deck shifts gently beneath you as the longship rides a swell. The movement is constant, subtle, yet persistent. Sleep must adapt to this motion as familiar as breathing. You close your eyes and focus on sensations. The weight of the cloak across your shoulders, the steady pressure of another's arm against yours, the faint vibration of water against the hull. Someone nearby mutters softly in half sleep. Another shifts, adjusting a leg cramped by the limited space. There is no privacy here, no solitary retreat, yet there is warmth in that shared vulnerability. A light snowfall begins, delicate flakes drifting under the edge of the sail before melting against fabric. You brush a few away from your sleeve. The sail rustles softly overhead. Your body gradually surrenders to fatigue. Muscles that rode earlier now relax, breath slows. Despite the cold, a pocket of tolerable warmth forms beneath layered cloaks and shared proximity. Researchers who examine endurance in cold maritime conditions often emphasize adaptation over resistance. You do not conquer the environment, you accommodate it. You learn where to place your body, how to angle your cloak, how to balance ventilation and insulation. As sleep draws nearer, you feel the ship's movement blend with the rhythm of your own breathing. The sea lifts you gently, lowers you again. The cold remains at the edges, yet it no longer dominates your awareness. There is no glowing hearth, no crackling firelight dancing on carved beams, only stars above and wood beneath, only wool and breath and trust. You shift once more, drawing your knees slightly toward your chest to conserve heat. The person beside you adjusts instinctively, maintaining contact. The night deepens, yet within this narrow band of timber floating across winter's water, warmth persists. And as your thoughts soften into dreams, you realize that even without walls or flame, rest is possible when preparation, cooperation, and quiet resilience carry you forward. Dawn returns in a wash of pale silver, and with it comes the quiet authority of leadership. You notice it not in grand gestures, but in small decisions. The chieftain stands near the prow, cloak wrapped tightly, yet posture steady. His beard is rimmed lightly with frost, much like yours. There is no elevated platform for him, no insulated chamber set apart from the crew. He endures the same cold. That shared exposure matters. Historical studies of Viking-age social structure suggest that while chieftains commanded loyalty and respect, their authority often depended on demonstrated competence and generosity, rather than distant aloofness. Standing here on an open deck in winter, you understand why. A leader who shivered apart from the crew would inspire little trust. The morning tasks resume, ice checked, sail adjusted, provisions counted. The chieftain moves among the men, offering brief words, sometimes only a nod. His presence reinforces rhythm. No one rushes. No one lingers unnecessarily. You feel the subtle lift in morale when he pauses near your bench and comments quietly on yesterday's rowing strength. It is not exaggerated praise, merely acknowledgement. Yet it warms more effectively than any flame. There is a long-standing academic conversation about how leadership functioned during extended voyages. Some scholars emphasize rigid hierarchy. Others point toward a more negotiated authority within tight-knit crews. As you watch this interplay, you sense that winter conditions demand both firmness and flexibility. A curious note appears in certain saga passages describing leaders sharing extra portions of food or drink with exhausted crew members during harsh travel. Whether these moments were romanticized later is uncertain, but the image lingers. You imagine the symbolic weight of such generosity when rations are precious. The chieftain confers briefly with the helmsman, eyes scanning the horizon. Decisions about route speed and risk rest heavily in these exchanges. In winter, error carries harsher consequences. You pull your cloak tighter and take your place at the oar once more. The chieftain does not exempt himself. He rows alongside, your hands gripping wood like any other. His sleeves are damp at the cuffs. His breath fogs in the same cold air. Leadership through participation becomes tangible here. Shared hardship builds credibility. There is a practical observation often cited by historians of seafaring communities that morale in extreme conditions hinges on perceived fairness. If burdens are distributed unevenly, resentment grows quickly. In this longship, at least today, balance appears maintained. The sea stretches outward in muted grey tones. Thin sheets of ice drift at a distance, but your course avoids them. The wind is moderate enough to assist, but not overwhelm. A younger crew member falters slightly at the oar shoulders, trembling after hours of labour. The chieftain notices immediately. Without public reprimand, he signals for a brief rotation. Another steps in. The rhythm continues unbroken. Researchers examining early Scandinavian leadership often highlight the importance of reputation carried through storytelling. Deeds at sea, especially during adversity, likely echoed long after return to shore. You imagine how tales of this voyage might be told in a smoky hall one winter night years from now. The cold today feels less hostile, perhaps because your body has adjusted, or perhaps because confidence in those around you has deepened. Trust acts as insulation in its own way. You glance toward the prow where carved wood cuts through steady waves. The chieftain stands there again, scanning for subtle shifts in wind. Snow clouds gather faintly in the far distance, but nothing immediate threatens. There is an understated psychological comfort in visible leadership. In the absence of heating systems, in the absence of enclosed safety, direction and reassurance come from human figures rather than structures. A small yet evocative detail preserved in some Norse sources describes leaders invoking the favour of certain gods before difficult passages, sometimes quietly, sometimes aloud. Whether ritual or habit, such moments reinforced unity. You do not hear formal invocation now, but you sense shared resolve. The day progresses with measured efficiency. Rowing alternates with sail management. Water is rationed carefully. No dramatic events interrupt the flow. As evening approaches, once more the chieftain helps secure the sail canopy. His hands are reddened from cold knuckles scraped faintly from earlier work. He does not conceal it. You settle beneath your cloak and reflect briefly on the nature of endurance. Without heating, without barriers between body and wind, authority rests not in comfort but in example. The sea remains cold. The sky deepens towards twilight. Yet the longship moves forward steadily, guided by decisions made with clarity and shared effort. And as you close your eyes, you understand that survival in brutal winter voyages depends as much on human leadership as on wood and wool. The cold presses close, but it does not rule alone. The sea changes character as you push farther west. It grows broader, more deliberate in its movement. The coastline, once a near companion, now appears only faintly on the horizon or disappears entirely for hours at a time. You feel the difference in your bones. Open water carries a different weight. Routes toward Iceland, Greenland and beyond were not casual detours. They were calculated risks. It is well established in historical research that Norse voyagers reached Iceland in the late 9th century, and Greenland soon after establishing settlements in landscapes defined by cold and isolation. Winter crossings along these routes demanded endurance of the highest order. You stand near the rail and study the sea. Swells rise longer and deeper here. The wind cuts unobstructed across vast distances, carrying sharper chill. Spray feels colder somehow, as if drawn from deeper reservoirs. The crew adjusts accordingly, extra care is taken in securing gear, provisions are counted again. Distances between potential harbours stretch dramatically compared to sheltered Scandinavian fjords. There is a continuing scholarly discussion about whether most long-distance voyages were timed to avoid the harshest winter months. Some historians argue that summer departures were standard for Atlantic crossings. Others point to saga accounts suggesting that necessity sometimes pushed ships into colder seasons. Standing here feeling the raw wind of open ocean, you sense that only strong motive would justify such timing. A small but intriguing observation from archaeological excavations in Greenland reveals that settlers adapted clothing and shelter techniques further once established, incorporating more fur and thicker construction. That evolution suggests that winter sea travel was only the beginning of cold adaptation. You adjust your cloak as another swell lifts the prow. The horizon feels immense. There are no comforting cliffs rising nearby, no quick inlet to seek if weather shifts suddenly. You are committed to this stretch. Rowing resumes in steady intervals to maintain course against crosswinds. Your arms move almost automatically now, muscle memory guiding each pull. The cold seems sharper in open water, yet your body responds with familiar warmth from exertion. Bird life changes too. Fewer coastal species circle overhead. Instead, you spot distant seabirds that glide effortlessly across wind currents. Their presence hints at proximity to land far beyond sight, yet offers no immediate shelter. There is an understated reality acknowledged by maritime historians as that long open crossings required careful estimation of distance and supply. Misjudgment could leave crews stranded far from shore in brutal conditions. You glance toward the provision chest and feel a flicker of awareness about how finite your resources are. A curious tidbit from later Icelandic writing describes sailors watching the colour of water and the smell of air to detect proximity to land even before birds appeared. Whether this was refined skill or retrospective embellishment remains uncertain. You inhale deeply, testing the wind for any hint of change. The sea itself feels colder here. Ice floes appear more frequently, drifting like pale ghosts across dark water. The helmsman navigates carefully between them, adjusting course subtly to avoid contact. Scholars continue to examine how Norse shipbuilders prepared vessels for encounters with sea ice. The flexible clinker construction you had observed earlier likely played a crucial role. Instead of shattering on impact, the hull can yield slightly absorbing pressure. You watch a small floe slide past the hull, brushing lightly against wood with a faint grinding sound. The ship flexes and moves on. Conversation among the crew is quieter in these stretches. The vastness commands attention. Each man seems to retreat slightly inward, conserving energy and focus. As daylight shortens, the open ocean reflects the dimming sky in endless grey gradients. There is no landmark to break the monotony, only wind, water, and the steady rhythm of oars. Without heating, without walls, the scale of this environment feels more pronounced. There is nothing between you and the elements except timber and layered wool. Yet you are not helpless. The longship continues forward with determined grace. Your body generates warmth through movement. Your mind stays anchored by shared purpose. You glance once more toward the horizon, imagining distant shores where snow-covered fields await. The route is demanding, yet history confirms that such crossings were achieved. Communities were built across these waters. The cold remains relentless, but so does human intention. And as the longship presses onward into the broader Atlantic, you realize that winter does not merely test survival, it defines it. Out here, in the wide open expanse, endurance becomes your most reliable compass. By the third morning in open water, the sea begins to show its teeth in a quieter way, not through towering waves or roaring wind, but through drifting fields of ice that appear first as pale smudges on the horizon. You narrow your eyes and watch them grow slowly clearer. Flat white shapes scattered across dark water, some no larger than shields, others broad enough to resemble floating islands. The temperature seems to drop further as you approach them, though. Perhaps that is the imagination sharpened by caution. The air feels thinner, cleaner, almost brittle. It is generally accepted among historians that Norse voyages toward Greenland and beyond required navigation through regions where sea ice could appear unpredictably, especially outside the mildest months. These were not solid frozen oceans like in storybooks, but shifting barriers that demanded alert steering. You move closer to the side of the ship, studying how the helmsman adjusts course. He does not attempt to plough directly through the largest floes. Instead, he guides the longship into winding channels between them, reading the patterns as though they were currents in a river. The ice makes a different sound than waves. When a small piece brushes the hull, there is a hollow knock followed by a scraping whisper. The wood responds with a low creak, flexing slightly. That flexibility, once merely a design feature you admired, now feels essential. The overlapping planks bend under pressure rather than splintering. Iron rivets hold firm. You feel the vibration travel through the deck into your boots. There is an ongoing discussion among maritime scholars about how frequently Viking vessels actually ventured into heavier ice conditions versus hugging southern routes whenever possible. Some argue that accounts of extreme ice navigation are exaggerated in later storytelling. Others point to climatic fluctuations that may have made such encounters more common in certain periods. Standing here watching the pale masses drift around you, you sense that even limited ice demands respect. The crew remains unusually quiet. Eyes scan constantly. Oars are kept ready not just for propulsion, but for pushing away smaller fragments that drift too close. You take hold of your oar and lean over slightly as a chunk no larger than a barrel floats near the hull. With careful pressure you nudge it aside. The ice resists briefly, then slides away with a soft grinding noise. A small yet intriguing detail preserved in some northern traditions mentions sailors listening closely to the tone of wood under strain when pressed by ice. A sharp crack signalled danger. A deep groan signalled manageable pressure. Whether such distinctions were formalized or simply learned instinctively remains uncertain, yet you find yourself listening now for those subtle cues. Your breath clouds more densely in this colder pocket of sea. Frost gathers along the edge of your cloak where spray meets fabric. You wipe it away before it thickens. The sun hangs low and pale, reflecting off the ice in dazzling flashes that force you to squint. Light here is deceptive. It dances on surfaces that conceal depth and movement. Researchers studying historical climate patterns often note that the medieval North Atlantic experienced variations that affected ice distribution. Conditions may have shifted over decades, altering sailing windows. You cannot measure such changes here. You can only respond to what surrounds you. The longship threads carefully between floes, turning slightly then straightening. The helmsman's hands remain steady on the steering oar. You feel gratitude for his composure. A larger sheet of ice looms ahead, its edge jagged and uneven. The ship slows as oars dip into water in controlled strokes. You help angle the prow toward a narrow opening between two white masses. The passage is tight. For a moment silence deepens. The hull brushes lightly against one side. A faint shudder runs through the planks, but no splintering sound follows. You exhale slowly. Once through, the water opens slightly again. The ice thins, then spreads farther apart. There is no celebration, only continued vigilance. Ice is rarely uniform. It shifts with currents and wind capable of closing gaps unexpectedly. Without heated cabins to retreat into, without reinforced steel hulls, your survival depends on reading this frozen landscape accurately. Mistake could mean damage beyond a quick repair in water too cold for prolonged immersion. As afternoon light fades, the ice becomes tinged with pink and gold under the lowering sun. The scene is strangely beautiful. White fragments glowing against dark water. You take a moment to absorb that beauty even as you remain alert. The cold stings your cheeks. Your hands ache faintly within mittens. Yet you are here navigating a world that seems almost otherworldly. The longship moves forward, careful and deliberate wood and iron, carrying human determination through a maze of frozen obstacles. And in that narrow channel between drifting ice, you understand once more that survival without heating is not merely about warmth. It is about awareness, restraint, and the quiet strength to guide a fragile vessel through a shifting frozen sea. The ice thins behind you, and the sea opens once more into a vast rolling plain of grey. The air feels charged after that careful weaving through frozen corridors. Your muscles remain taut as if expecting another pale barrier to drift suddenly into view. But now a different presence settles among the crew. Faith. Not loud, not ceremonial, simply there woven into breath and glance and quiet habit. In the Viking Age, spiritual belief infused daily life rather than existing as a separate ritual confined to temples. This is a well-documented aspect of Norse culture. Gods were not distant abstractions. They were invoked in storms, thanked in harvest, and remembered in hardship. You notice one of the older men touch the small pendant at his neck, perhaps shaped like a hammer. Whether it represents Thor or simply carries personal meaning, it rests against his chest beneath wool layers. He does not announce his gesture. He simply presses it briefly between thumb and forefinger before returning to his oar. The sea is calmer now, yet winter remains relentless. The cold still presses at your collar. The wind still tastes of salt and iron. In such conditions, belief can become as practical as clothing. Elaborate departure were more common than elaborate ceremonies at sea. Others argue that the constant unpredictability of maritime life encouraged spontaneous invocation. Watching the crew, you sense that faith here is understated, almost intimate. A small and intriguing detail from certain saga accounts describes sailors casting small offerings into the sea before particularly dangerous passages. Whether these were symbolic gestures or routine practice is difficult to confirm, yet the idea lingers. You glance over the side at the dark water and imagine a coin or carved token slipping beneath the surface. The chieftain stands near the prow again, eyes on the horizon. You wonder what private thoughts pass through his mind. Does he measure risk solely in wind and wave, or does he also weigh favour and fate? The cold seems to sharpen reflection. In quieter moments between rowing shifts, your thoughts drift toward questions larger than directional provisions. What compels you to cross these waters in winter trade, perhaps? Settlement, reputation, survival of a community far behind you. Researchers who study Norse cosmology often emphasize the concept of fate woven into the fabric of existence like threads in cloth. We're destiny shaped yet not entirely fixed. Standing here on a narrow band of timber surrounded by frigid sea, that idea feels tangible. A gull cries faintly overhead, its sound carrying across the open water. You lift your face toward the sky. Clouds gather in slow drifting patterns, yet no storm threatens immediately. The crew resumes steady rowing as wind slackens briefly. Oars dip and rise, carving lines through water that reflect pale light. You feel warmth build again in your shoulders. Faith here does not replace effort, it accompanies it. No one lowers an oar because of divine protection. Instead, belief strengthens resolve. A curious detail preserved in later Icelandic sources mentions sailors interpreting certain natural phenomena as signs such as unusual light on the horizon or sudden shifts in bird behaviour. Whether these interpretations guided real decisions or were added later for narrative richness is debated. You find yourself scanning the sky with renewed attentiveness, wondering what meaning others might assign to subtle changes. As afternoon advances, the sea deepens in colour. The cold remains constant, yet your perception of it shifts. The harsh edge softens slightly under steady rhythm and shared purpose. Anthropologists examining endurance in extreme environments often note that a shared worldview can reduce fear by framing danger within a larger story. You feel that effect subtly. The sea is still dangerous, yet it no longer feels chaotic. It is part of a cosmos governed by forces understood, even if not controlled. You draw your cloak tighter and breathe slowly. Your exhale rises in a pale plume drifting toward the sky, as if carrying unspoken words with it. There is no altar here, no carved temple walls, only water, wind, wood, and wool. Yet within that simplicity, belief travels with you. As twilight begins its quiet descent, someone murmurs a brief phrase, perhaps a blessing for safe passage. Others nod faintly. No elaborate response follows. The longship continues forward, steady and resilient, and you realize that in the absence of heating, in the absence of solid walls, warmth sometimes comes from conviction. Conviction that you are not alone in this vast cold, conviction that effort matters, conviction that fate, whatever its shape, is met not with surrender, but with courage. The sea rolls on beneath you, indifferent yet immense, and you row sustained not only by muscle and wool, but by quiet belief carried within your chest. The sea remains open, yet your thoughts drift briefly toward who stands upon this deck with you. Not only warriors, not only hardened sailors. The image of Viking voyages often narrows itself to bearded men gripping oars in icy spray, yet history is rarely so simple. As the longship glides across winter water, you find yourself considering the quieter figures who may have endured similar crossings. It's firmly established through archaeological evidence and written sources that women travelled in the Viking world, particularly during settlement voyages to places such as Iceland and Greenland. Graves containing keys, spindle whorls and domestic items in these regions and suggest that families relocated, not merely raiding parties. That reality reshapes the scene in your mind. You imagine a woman seated near the centre of the ship, wrapped in layered wool like the rest of you, her hair braided tightly against wind. She may not take the oar in every shift, yet she shares the cold, the cramped space, the same unheated deck beneath her. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how frequently women joined long winter crossings versus arriving during more favourable seasons. Some historians argue that settlement voyages were carefully timed to avoid the harshest weather. Others point out that necessity and opportunity do not always align neatly with ideal conditions. Standing here, you sense that winter would not have excluded determined travellers. A small but compelling detail from certain burial sites in the North Atlantic reveals high-status women interred with ship-related goods, indicating familiarity with maritime life. Whether they sailed regularly or symbolically represented household authority is still debated, yet their presence complicates simplistic narratives. You glance at the centre of the deck where provisions are stored. In a settlement voyage, that space might also hold children bundled tightly in cloaks, eyes wide at the vastness of sea and sky. The thought alters the atmosphere. The cold feels sharper when imagined against smaller faces. The longship itself would not discriminate in its exposure. Wind cuts equally across all who stand or sit upon it. Spray chills any skin it touches. Anthropologists studying Norse society often highlight the complementary roles of men and women in expansion and settlement. Farming, weaving, animal husbandry, and domestic management required skilled hands. A new land could not thrive on warriors alone. You picture someone tending to simple tasks even at sea, adjusting cloth, checking stored food, offering quiet reassurance to a child unsettled by constant motion. Such acts generate warmth of a different kind. The sea today is steady but unwelcoming. Ice has thinned, yet the wind carries bite. You pull your cloak closer and resume rowing, feeling your muscles respond. A curious note appears in later medieval Icelandic literature describing women who demonstrated notable endurance during voyages, their composure praised alongside that of men. Whether these accounts reflect widespread reality or exceptional cases remains uncertain, yet they suggest admiration for resilience regardless of gender. The deck creaks as the ship rides another swell. You imagine how crowded it would feel with additional passengers. Space already feels precious. Shared warmth would intensify, yet privacy would shrink further. Researchers continue to examine isotopic evidence from skeletal remains in northern Atlantic settlements, seeking clues about who travelled and when. Such scientific methods add layers to stories once told only through saga. As you stand here, you become part of that larger mosaic of movement and adaptation. The sun dips lower again, painting the sea in muted tones. You feel fatigue in your arms, but also steadiness in your breath. Winter voyage demands more than brute strength. It requires patience, cooperation, and emotional resilience. Those qualities are not confined to one group alone. You glance around at the faces beside you. Each carries a story beyond this deck, families left behind, futures imagined elsewhere. Without heating, without protective cabins, every individual must endure the same cold reality. The longship offers no separate chamber for comfort, and perhaps that shared exposure is precisely what binds communities across these waters. As evening approaches and preparations for night begin once more, you reflect on how survival in brutal winter voyages depended not merely on who rowed the hardest, but on who endured together. The sea does not ask who you are before testing you. It only asks whether you can withstand its chill. And as the longship presses onward into the fading light, you carry with you a broader understanding of who might have stood upon these planks wrapped in wool, facing the same relentless winter wind. By the time the next cold dawn spreads across the sea, you feel it in your joints. Not injury exactly, not yet, but a heaviness that lingers in fingers and knees. Winter at sea is not a single dramatic event, it is accumulation. Cold layered in upon cold, a dampness that never fully disappears. You flex your hands slowly, watching how stiff they seem before movement restores some ease. The skin across your knuckles is reddened, faintly cracked despite wool protection. You rub them together, generating friction, coaxing life back into numb tips. It is a sober reality acknowledged by historians of seafaring that frostbite, respiratory illness, and general exhaustion were constant risks in prolonged cold exposure. Without modern medicine, even minor ailments could escalate. You're aware of that fragility now. A man near the bow coughs again, deeper this time. The sound carries sharply in the thin air. He pulls his cloak tighter, eyes watering slightly. Cold air irritates lungs. Salt spray aggravates throats. You move closer during the next rest interval, offering him a small portion of warmed liquid from a flask. It is not hot, but less icy than the barrel water. He nods gratefully. There is a persistent academic discussion about what remedies Viking crews might have carried on voyages. Herbal knowledge was well developed in Scandinavian societies. Dried plants, simple salves, perhaps even honey for soothing throats. Whether such supplies accompanied every winter journey is uncertain, yet it seems plausible that some medicinal familiarity travelled with them. You glance at your own skin, where cloak meets neck. A faint pale patch forms along the edge of your cheek where wind has bitten hardest. You press your mitten there, gently warming it before it grows numb. A small yet intriguing detail appears in medieval Icelandic texts, describing the use of animal fat rubbed onto exposed skin to create a barrier against harsh wind. Whether this was common practice or occasional improvisation remains debated, but you can imagine its practicality. The scent might linger, yet protection matters more than elegance. The deck beneath you is dry today, ice cleared earlier. Yet cold radiates upward relentlessly. You stamp your feet lightly, keeping circulation active. Injury at sea is not always dramatic. A slipped boot on ice, a strained shoulder from rowing, a cracked lip that refuses to heal. Each small wound demands attention because there is no warm cabin to retreat into for recovery. Maritime historians often emphasize that crew rotation and mutual support were essential in preventing exhaustion from turning into incapacitation. You feel that wisdom in practice as tasks shift fluidly. No one is expected to endure without relief. The coughing man rests briefly beneath the sail canopy while another takes his place at the oar. There is no resentment in the exchange, only recognition of shared vulnerability. You examine your own toes inside leather boots during a brief pause. They respond sluggishly but remain sensitive. You wiggle them deliberately, grateful for sensation. There is a curious note preserved in some Norse medical traditions describing the warming of chilled limbs by gradual immersion in lukewarm water rather than direct heat. Rapid temperature change could damage tissue further. While such controlled treatment is not possible aboard this open ship, the principle of gradual warming informs how you treat yourself. Slow rubbing, gentle movement, patience. The sea remains steady, though grey clouds gather faintly on the horizon. You hope they bring no additional storm. Researchers studying skeletal remains from Norse settlements have identified evidence of arthritis and healed fractures suggesting lives of physical strain. Winter voyages likely compounded such wear. You feel a twinge in your shoulder and wonder how many crossings it can endure over a lifetime. Despite these realities, resilience persists. The coughing man returns to his place, later breath steadier. You nod at him briefly, he nods back. Food is passed around again in modest portions. Calories support not just muscle but immune defense, though you would not frame it in those terms. You simply know that eating strengthens you. Without heating, without enclosed refuge, the body becomes both battleground and shield. You must monitor it closely, listen to its signals, adjust pace accordingly. As afternoon light fades, you pull your cloak tighter and sit for a moment near the mast, letting your back rest against solid wood. The cold still seeps in, but you feel grounded. The longship continues forward, carrying not only provisions and hopes, but the fragile health of every soul aboard. And as you rise once more to take your place at the oar, you recognize that survival in brutal winter voyages is not only about weather and design. It's about tending to the body with quiet diligence, refusing to let small ailments grow unchecked. The sea tests you in waves and wind. The cold tests you in subtler ways, yet you endure adjusting, supporting and moving forward despite the ache in your joints and the sting in your lungs. Out here, health of itself becomes a precious cargo you guard as carefully as any treasure. The wind shifts again, gentler now, and the longship settles into a steady glide that feels almost purposeful. You sense that this leg of the journey is not merely transit. There is intention behind it. Trade, even in winter commerce, does not entirely sleep. It is well supported by historical evidence that Viking voyages were not solely about raiding. Trade networks stretched across the North Atlantic and deep into continental Europe, connecting Scandinavia to distant markets. Furs, walrus, ivory, amber, iron, dried fish. Goods moved along these sea routes despite cold and risk. You glance toward the chests secured at the centre of the deck. Within them may rest items destined for exchange. Pelts folded carefully, carved antler pieces, perhaps even small quantities of precious metal tucked discreetly away. Winter trade might seem counterintuitive, yet there are advantages. Certain goods such as furs are most valuable in colder months. Ice-covered rivers can create easier overland travel once ships reach shore. The season shapes opportunity as much as it shapes hardship. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how seasonal rhythms influenced Viking trade patterns. Some researchers argue that major commercial voyages were concentrated in warmer months. Others point to evidence suggesting year-round movement, particularly between established settlements in the North Atlantic. Standing here in biting wind, you suspect that necessity often overruled preference. You run a hand over one of the chests, feeling the rough grain beneath your mitten. Inside perhaps lies walrus ivory harvested from distant shores. That ivory, prized in medieval Europe for carving, travelled vast distances by ship and caravan. Its journey likely included winter crossings such as this. A small but compelling detail from archaeological discoveries in Greenland reveals workshops where ivory was shaped before export, indicating that even in harsh climates, craftsmanship thrived. You imagine the careful hands that prepared those pieces, unaware that their work would endure centuries. The sea today is calmer than in recent days, yet the cold persists. Trade does not soften winter, it merely gives purpose to endurance. You take your place at the oar during a short rowing interval, feeling the familiar pull in your shoulders. Each stroke propels not just bodies but goods across water. There is a quiet practicality in how provisions are rationed. Trade items must remain dry. Chests are inspected for leaks after each encounter with spray. Tar seams are checked again. Researchers studying Viking commerce often highlight the adaptability of these networks. Markets shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, sea routes adjusted to political and environmental pressures. In winter, flexibility would have been even more critical. A curious note from certain medieval accounts describes traders using small tokens or carved markers to signify trust agreements across regions. Whether such tokens accompanied winter voyages frequently is uncertain, yet the idea of portable contracts carried in wooden boxes feels fitting. You glance toward the horizon where a faint line suggests distant land. Perhaps a settlement where goods will change hands, perhaps only another stretch of coast. The longship carries not only cargo but reputation. Reliable arrival in winter could strengthen alliances. Failure here could weaken them. Without heating, without comfort, the stakes feel heightened. Every cold night endured contributes to the success of an exchange yet unseen. The crew remains focused. Conversation drifts toward what might be acquired in return. Grain, perhaps, metal tools, news from other settlements. Trade is not merely material. It carries information, stories, connections. Anthropologists often emphasize the social dimension of exchange in early medieval societies. Gifts and goods reinforce bonds. You sense that beneath the practical goal of acquiring resources lies a deeper network of relationships sustained across these icy waters. As dusk approaches, the sea reflects muted tones of violet and grey. The cold deepens again, settling around your collar. You tighten ropes, securing the cargo once more before nightfall. Even a small shift during sleep could cause damage. Vigilance never rests. Trade in winter demands the same resilience as settlement or exploration. Perhaps more. Profit must outweigh risk. You step back and survey the deck. Chest secure, sail trimmed, crew steady. The longship glides forward bearing wool-clad figures and carefully packed goods through the chill. And you realize that survival in these conditions is not solely about enduring cold for its own sake. It is about carrying something valuable across that cold. Something worth the frost on your beard and the ache in your arms. The sea does not care what lies within your chests. But you do. And so you row guarding cargo and comrades alike as winter tightens its hold around the horizon. The cold sharpens everything, even ambition. You sense it in the quiet way certain glances are exchanged when distant land appears on the horizon. Not a friendly settlement this time, something smaller. Perhaps a lightly defended outpost, perhaps a cluster of storehouses near a sheltered bay. Winter attacks, while less common than raiding, formed part of the broader maritime strategy alongside a trade and settlement. Winter attacks, while less common than summer campaigns, were not unknown. Frozen ground could harden pathways. Reduced agricultural activity might leave communities less vigilant. You stand at the rail, studying the coastline as it grows clearer. Snow blankets fields beyond the shore. Smoke rises faintly from a structure near the waterline. The scene appears peaceful, almost fragile. There is a continuing academic discussion about how frequently winter raids occurred versus being dramatized in later chronicles. Some scholars argue that harsh weather limited aggressive expeditions. Others point to strategic advantages in surprise and reduced resistance. As you observe the quiet settlement ahead, you understand how opportunity might tempt bold leaders. The longships slow slightly, maintaining distance, while the chieftain and a few trusted men confer in low tones. The wind carries fragments of their words indistinct. A small yet intriguing detail preserved in certain medieval annals describes winter raids catching communities off guard precisely because travel was assumed to be minimal during colder months. Whether those accounts exaggerate for narrative effect is uncertain, yet the element of surprise feels plausible. You feel tension gather in your shoulders. Raiding in winter adds another layer of risk. Cold already strains your body. Combat would amplify that strain. The decision seems measured. After several minutes, the chieftain signals a subtle shift in course away from the settlement. Trade and survival outweigh plunder today. The longship angles back toward open water. Relief mingles with a faint echo of unrealized ambition. You exhale slowly, unaware you had been holding breath. Historians often emphasize that Viking groups were pragmatic. Raiding required calculation. Supplies were the crew condition. Winter might diminish defenses ashore, but it also reduced your margin for error at sea. The coastline drifts gradually behind you. Snow glitters along its edge under pale sun. You reflect on how easily the narrative of Viking life becomes one-dimensional in modern imagination. Yet here choices are nuanced. Without heating aboard, without reserve comfort, the crew must weigh every exertion carefully. A winter raid could deplete the energy needed for safe return. Injuries sustained in freezing conditions would heal poorly. Researchers examining patterns of conflict in early medieval Europe note fluctuations tied to seasonality, resource availability, and political dynamics. Standing here, you appreciate that such patterns were shaped by lived experience of cold wind and limited daylight. A curious fragment from later saga tradition recounts warriors boasting of winter exploits precisely because of their difficulty. Enduring cold while achieving victory elevated reputation. Whether those tales reflect frequent reality or exceptional bravado remains debated, yet the allure of such glory lingers in human nature. You adjust your cloak as the wind strengthens slightly. The longship regains steady pace, leaving the potential target behind. The sea feels colder again once land recedes. Spray bites at your cheek. You welcome the familiar rhythm of rowing more than the uncertain prospect of sudden conflict. There is something grounding about choosing restraint. The chieftain stands near the mast, gaze fixed forward. You sense his calculation continues. Survival remains priority. As twilight begins to soften the edges of sea and sky, you reflect on the delicate balance between risk and endurance. Winter magnifies consequences. Each decision reverberates more sharply in cold air. Without heated refuge, without easy repair of injury, prudence becomes its own strength. The longship moves onward not toward plunder this time, but towards safer horizons. And you understand that surviving brutal winter voyages requires not only courage to act, but wisdom to refrain. The cold sea offers enough challenge without adding unnecessary fire to it. You tighten your grip on the oar and pull steady and measured, grateful that tonight's trial will be wind and frost alone. By late afternoon, a subtle change in the ship's voice catches your attention. It is not dramatic, not a crack or a snap. More a faint irregular knock beneath the steady rhythm of waves against the hull. You pause mid-stroke and listen carefully. There it is again, a hollow tap from somewhere near the midsection. Maintenance at sea never truly ends. It is well documented in maritime archaeology that Viking ships required constant upkeep, especially during extended voyages. Iron rivets could loosen. Tar seams might thin. Planks flexing repeatedly against cold water could shift imperceptibly. You exchange a glance with the man opposite you. He hears it too. The rowing slows and then halts. The chieftain gestures toward the center of the deck. Two crew members kneel and lift a chest aside, exposing more of the inner hull. You crouch beside them, breath fogging as you lean close. The sound repeats when a swell lifts the ship slightly. A rivet head gleams faintly against dark wood. There is an ongoing discussion among ship historians about how quickly repairs could be made at sea versus waiting for landfall. Some argue that minor adjustments were routine even in open water. Others suggest that only urgent fixes were attempted offshore. Watching the crew work, you sense that this falls into the urgent category. A small hammer appears along with a wedge of wood. The man with the hammer tests the rivet, gently tapping once. The tone is duller than the surrounding fastenings. Another intriguing detail from preserved ship finds reveals that spare rivets were often carried aboard for precisely this reason. Whether every voyage included such backups remains uncertain, yet it would be prudent. You imagine small iron pieces wrapped in cloth within a toolkit. The tapping continues, careful and deliberate. Too hard and you risk cracking the plank. Too light and the looseness remains. The sea does not pause for your repair. Swells continue to lift and lower the hull. You brace yourself with one hand against a beam while observing. Cold complicates everything. Iron stiffens, fingers numb. Precision becomes harder to maintain. You flex your hands briefly before assisting by holding the plank steady from inside. The rivet is tightened gradually. Each strike of the hammer rings softly through the hull, a muted echo of resilience. Researchers studying the durability of clinker-built ships often emphasize how their overlapping planks distribute stress across the structure. That design makes localized repairs possible without dismantling large sections. You appreciate that ingenuity now more than ever. Once the rivet feels secure, tar is warmed slightly between gloved hands and pressed carefully along the seam. It smells sharp and resinous even in the cold. The deck shifts again as a wave passes. You hold your breath listening. The irregular knock does not return. Relief moves quietly through the group. The chest is lowered back into place. Tools are stowed. A curious anecdote from later maritime lore suggests that sailors sometimes spoke to their ships during repairs as though addressing a living companion. Whether literal or metaphorical, the idea resonates. The longship feels less like an object and more like a partner in endurance. You rise slowly, knees stiff from crouching. The cold seeps back into your fingers as the brief burst of focused work ends, yet warmth lingers from the effort. The rowing resumes more cautiously at first. The hull responds smoothly. No further irregular sounds emerge. Scholars continue to examine how Viking crews balance speed with longevity of their vessels. Pushing too hard in winter could accelerate wear. Prudence likely shaped many decisions. As evening approaches, you glance along the length of the ship. Shields hang steady, sail taut, crew focused. Without heating, without protective enclosures, the longship itself is your lifeline. Every plank and rivet matters profoundly. You tighten your cloak and take a slow breath. The repair may seem small, almost invisible from a distance, yet it embodies the quiet diligence that sustains survival. The sea remains cold and indifferent. The sky dims toward twilight, but beneath your boots timber holds firm once more, and you carry on trusting that attentive hands and patient craftsmanship will keep this fragile vessel intact against the endless winter water. The cold air carries sound differently. You notice it as dusk settles and the sea stretches wide and nearly empty around you. The wind has dropped to a low whisper, and in its absence every small noise seems to travel farther than it should. A cough near the bow echoes faintly toward the stern. The creak of a rope against wood sounds almost amplified. Even your own breath, slow and measured, feels louder in the stillness. It's often observed by those who study northern climates that cold, dense air can carry sound over longer distances with surprising clarity. While Viking sailors would not have framed it in scientific terms, they would have recognized the effect. You sense it now as the longship glides forward in near silence. Communication becomes subtle under such conditions. Shouting is unnecessary and unwise. Your voice might travel farther than intended. You watch as the helmsman raises 2 fingers briefly signaling a slight adjustment in course. No words, just gesture. The oars respond. There is a continuing scholarly discussion about how standardized signaling methods may have been among Viking crews. Some historians suggest that simple hand gestures and horn blasts coordinated fleets effectively. Others argue that practices varied widely depending on region and leader. Standing here in the thin winter air, you appreciate the economy of quiet signals. A faint sound drifts across the water, distant and indistinct. Perhaps another vessel, perhaps ice shifting against itself. You narrow your eyes, scanning the horizon. The crew grow still, listening. Without heating, without enclosed walls to muffle noise, you're exposed not only to cold but to every whisper of the environment. That exposure becomes an advantage if used wisely. A small and intriguing detail from saga literature mentions the use of horns or simple whistles aboard ships to signal during fog or darkness. Whether these tools were commonly carried on winter voyages is uncertain, yet their practicality seems evident. You imagine the low moan of a horn carrying across cold water, warning allies or challenging strangers. The distant sound fades. Perhaps it was nothing more than wind shifting through ice. The helmsman relaxes slightly but remains alert. You adjust your cloak and shift your weight. The deck beneath you feels solid, repaired rivets holding firm. The cold seeps through wool layers, yet your body remains warm enough from intermittent rowing. Night deepens. Stars emerge one by one, reflected faintly on the sea's surface. The longship becomes a narrow silhouette moving through silver darkness. Researchers studying early maritime encounters note that visibility at sea could determine whether meetings turned peaceful or hostile. In winter, reduced daylight and unpredictable weather increased uncertainty. You feel that tension subtly now, even in calm conditions. A gull cries sharply somewhere off to your left, startling in the quiet. Its call slices through the air, then fades. You lean slightly over the rail and listen to the water brushing against the hull. The sound is steady and reassuring. No regular knocks, no scraping ice. Communication aboard the ship remains minimal. A nod, a brief touch on the shoulder, shared glances. The cold air preserves not only sound, but intention. Words feel heavier here, spoken only when needed. A curious observation preserved in some medieval accounts suggests that experienced sailors could identify approaching weather changes by subtle shifts in how sound travelled across water. Whether this skill was as precise as described is debated, yet you find yourself listening for nuance in the wind. The sea tonight seems almost contemplative. Long gentle swells lift and lower the prow. The moon casts a faint path of light ahead. You feel a strange clarity in the stillness. Without constant gusts or crashing waves, your senses sharpen. The cold no longer roars, it whispers. And in that whisper you understand that survival without heating involves more than endurance of temperature. It involves attunement. Attunement to sound, attunement to gesture, attunement to subtle cues that signal danger or safety. The longship continues forward quiet and deliberate. Every creak of timber speaks of resilience. Every muted splash confirms steady progress. You draw a slow breath and let it drift into the night. The cold air carries it outward, dissolving it into the vast dark. And you remain alert, listening not only with ears, but with instinct as winter sea and wooden hull converse around you. At last a familiar scent reaches you on the wind. It is faint at first, almost imagined. A trace of earth beneath the salt. A whisper of pine carried across cold air. You lift your head and inhale again, more deliberately this time. Land. The horizon ahead begins to sharpen, revealing the outline of fjords you know well. Snow crowns their ridges. Dark forests press down toward the water's edge. After days of open sea, the sight feels almost intimate. It is widely recognised that Scandinavian coastlines, with their deep fjords and sheltered inlets, offered natural havens for returning vessels. These waterways were not merely geographic features. They were lifelines guiding ships safely home through narrow passages, protected from the worst ocean swells. You feel the crew's posture shift subtly. Shoulders straighten, eyes brighten. Even the cold seems less intrusive when land rises ahead. The longship angles toward a familiar channel between cliffs. The water here grows calmer, reflecting the pale winter sky in muted tones. Ice clings lightly along the shoreline, but the channel remains navigable. There is an ongoing scholarly conversation about how early Norse navigators memorized coastal landmarks with remarkable precision. Oral transmission of such knowledge allowed even younger sailors to recognize distinctive rock formations or tree-lined ridges. As you study the curve of a headland ahead, you sense that recognition in your own chest. A small but evocative detail preserved in later Icelandic writings describes returning crews sounding horn softly upon entering home fjords, announcing their arrival to those on shore. Whether this was common practice in winter or reserved for calmer seasons remains uncertain, yet the image lingers warmly. The longship glides deeper into the fjord. Snow blankets the slopes on either side, creating a quiet amphitheatre of whitened stone. Smoke rises faintly from distant roofs tucked along the shoreline. Your breath clouds gently as you exhale, no longer whipped away by open sea wind. The air feels different here. Colder perhaps, but less hostile. Rowing slows as the sail is lowered. Oars dip in steady, deliberate strokes to guide the ship toward a familiar landing point. The hull brushes lightly against packed snow at the water's edge. Men leap ashore, boots crunching firmly on frozen ground. Ropes are secured around stout posts or natural rock anchors, worn smooth by years of similar arrivals. You step onto land and feel its solidity beneath your feet. After days of constant motion, the stillness is almost disorienting. Your knees bend slightly as your body adjusts. Researchers studying Norse seasonal patterns often note that winter months were spent primarily in settlements, repairing tools, tending livestock, and sharing stories of voyages completed. Standing here, you sense that transition beginning. A curious tidbit from archaeological excavations in Scandinavian coastal villages reveals layers of compacted sand and timber near common landing sites, suggesting frequent use even in colder months. The sea did not entirely pause in winter. You glance back at the longship resting against snow. Its hull bears faint scars from ice and storm. Its sail is stiff from salt and frost, yet it has endured. Voices drift faintly from the settlement beyond. Figures move toward the shore, cloaked against cold. Recognition spreads quietly through the gathered crew. Without heating aboard, without walls to buffer wind, this return feels earned in a way difficult to articulate. Every frozen night, every scraped plank, every shared breath has led here. You remove your wool cap briefly, letting crisp air brush your hair. Smoke from hearth fires carries a comforting scent across the snow. It mingles with salt and pine in a fragrance uniquely tied to home. The longship will need inspection and rest, so will you. The fjord embraces the vessel gently, its waters calm and dark. Snow reflects soft twilight as it settles across rooftops and slopes, and as you walk toward the waiting settlement boots pressing into the familiar ground, you feel a warmth not solely from fire or shelter. It comes from return, from knowing that you have crossed brutal winter seas without heating, guided only by wood, wool and will. The cold remains in the air, but it no longer feels endless. You are home. In the days that follow your return, the longship rests on shore like a tired animal. Snow gathers along its keel where it has been drawn up beyond the tide line. The sail is unfurled carefully and stretched between posts to dry fully. Cloaks are hung near hearths, boots are loosened and cleaned of salt. Yet your thoughts linger not only on what you endured, but on what remains behind for others to discover. It's firmly grounded in archaeological research that Viking ships were sometimes preserved in burials sunk deliberately in bogs or abandoned in conditions that slowed decay. These rare survivals offer glimpses into construction methods, materials, and even traces of daily life aboard. You walk slowly along the length of your vessel, tracing the curve of overlapping planks. Iron rivets gleam faintly where frost has melted. You imagine centuries passing wood sinking into damp soil preserved by chance. Excavations at sites like Oseberg and Gokstad revealed not only ships but textiles, tools and personal items. Such finds transformed modern understanding of Viking maritime culture. The survival of fabric fragments confirmed the prevalence of woolen garments and complex weaving techniques. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about how representative those burial ships are of everyday longships used in harsh voyages. Some researchers argue that ceremonial vessels may differ subtly from workaday ships. Others believe the core design remained consistent across contexts. As you study your own vessel, salt-stained and practical, you sense continuity between function and form. A small yet captivating detail uncovered in certain ship burials includes remnants of bedding, possibly made from wool or feathers. Whether such comforts accompanied active winter voyages regularly is uncertain, yet their presence hints at the blending of practicality and status. You kneel and inspect a seam near the midsection, remembering the rivet you helped secure at sea. That tiny repair would leave no grand mark in future excavation, yet countless such adjustments contributed to survival. Researchers examining microscopic wear patterns on preserved planks have identified areas of heavy foot traffic, suggesting where crew most frequently stood or sat. You glance toward your usual rowing position and imagine future scholars tracing similar marks, speculating about life aboard. Without heating systems to leave traces of soot or chimney residue, evidence of warmth at sea must be inferred indirectly. Patterns of textile thickness, tool placement, even the absence of certain features all speak quietly. You run your hand along a shield rim, remembering frost crusting its surface in open water. That memory will not fossilize in wood, yet it lives within you. A curious discovery from one North Atlantic site revealed fragments of tar with embedded fibers suggesting active maintenance aboard ship. Such details, minute and easily overlooked, offer insight into daily routines that rarely make their way into epic tales. The settlement around you resumes winter rhythm. Livestock are tended, nets repaired, stories retold by hearthlight. Archaeologists centuries later will piece together these rhythms from scattered artifacts, soil layers, and preserved beams. They will debate timelines, routes, and seasonal patterns. Some will argue that winter voyages were rarer than legends suggest. Others will point to climatic data indicating periods of milder winters that made such crossings more feasible. Standing beside your longship, you understand that each voyage leaves faint signatures. A worn plank, a replaced rivet, a patched cloak. Evidence of survival without heating is subtle. It resides in adaptation rather than infrastructure. The ship will be inspected thoroughly before its next journey. Tar reapplied where needed, iron checked, sail rewoven in places. And you will carry forward knowledge etched not into parchment but into muscle memory. When future generations uncover remnants of ships like yours, they may marvel at craftsmanship, at daring exploration, at cultural expansion. Yet they may not fully grasp the intimate texture of cold wind on wool, the shared breath beneath a sail, the steady scrape of ice from deck planks. Those details fade quickly unless preserved in story. You step back and take in the full curve of the hull against snow. It stands as both artifact and companion. Winter still grips the land, yet hearth smoke rises steadily from nearby halls. The longship rests silent for now, and somewhere in the distant future, hands not yet born will brush soil from timbers like these, and wonder how you endured the brutal winter sea without heat. You would tell them simply, with wool, with wood, with one another. Years later, long after your own voyage has faded into memory, others will try to follow your wake. Not in sagas, in experiments. You imagine modern sailors standing on reconstructed longships dressed in carefully researched wool garments determined to test what you once endured without written instruction. They launch from Scandinavian harbours with cameras watching and support crews nearby, yet the sea remains authentically cold. It is a well-established reality that in recent decades experimental archaeology has sought to recreate Viking-age ships and sailing techniques to better understand their capabilities. Replicas such as those inspired by the Gokstad and Oseberg finds have crossed the North Atlantic, demonstrating that clinker-built vessels were remarkably seaworthy. You picture these modern crews stepping aboard, perhaps with safety equipment hidden discreetly out of view, yet committed to minimizing modern comfort. They choose winter for authenticity. They feel the same wind against their faces that you once did. There is an ongoing academic conversation about how closely such reconstructions can replicate original conditions. Materials differ slightly. Modern knowledge of nutrition and hypothermia informs decisions. Rescue options exist. Still, the physical experience of cold spray and open deck remains real. A curious anecdote from one such voyage describes crew members expressing surprise at how effective layered wool proved in damp conditions, challenging assumptions that modern fabrics are always superior. They reported warmth persisting even when outer layers absorbed spray. That observation echoes what you already knew instinctively. You imagine them huddling beneath a sail canopy at night, rediscovering the simple physics of shared body heat. Cameras may record their breath rising in pale clouds, yet the sensation on skin remains unchanged across centuries. Researchers involved in these projects often emphasize that written sources alone cannot convey the embodied reality of maritime life. Only by feeling the deck shift underfoot, by scraping ice with numbed fingers, can insight deepen. You picture a modern helmsman navigating by sun and shoreline, deliberately avoiding GPS for part of the journey. The tension would feel familiar, the horizon would remain immense. There is debate among historians regarding how far experimental voyages can illuminate everyday practice. Some argue that modern crews cannot fully replicate the psychological stakes of ancient travellers whose lives depended entirely on success. Others counter that physical experience still yields valuable understanding. You suspect both perspectives hold truth. A small yet telling detail from one reconstruction expedition noted that rowing in cold conditions generated substantial internal heat, confirming how essential muscle movement was for survival. Crew members reportedly shed outer layers briefly during intense effort despite freezing air. You smile at the recognition of that rhythm. The sea itself does not distinguish between centuries. Wind lashes the same. Ice drifts unpredictably. Wood flexes under pressure in consistent ways. As you imagine these modern sailors confronting winter without heaters, you feel a quiet kinship across time. They carry insulated sleeping bags, perhaps as backup, yet when they choose to rely on wool and cooperation, they step closer to your reality. Anthropologists and maritime historians observe that such reenactments foster appreciation for the ingenuity embedded in early ship design. Flexibility of hull, efficiency of sail, adaptability of crew. Without heating systems, without metal stoves tucked safely below deck, survival depended on a delicate balance of design and discipline. That lesson remains intact whether in the 9th century or the 21st. You imagine one of these experimental sailors standing at the rail at dusk, breath fogging in familiar patterns, reflecting on those who crossed before him. Perhaps he wonders about the subtle aches in his shoulders, about the frost on his beard, about the quiet strength required to endure. The modern world surrounds him, yet for a moment he inhabits your narrow band of timber and wool, and through that embodied memory the past breathes again. Winter sea remains unyielding. Technology may evolve, but cold retains its authority. As the imagined longship of the present presses forward guided by curiosity and respect, it confirms something profound. You were not reckless. You were skilled. You were prepared. And even centuries later, others must lean on the same fundamentals to survive brutal winter voyages without heat. Wood, wool, will. The sea accepts nothing less. You stand once more beside the longship snow quiet around you, and let all the fragments of the voyage gather gently in your mind. The first sting of wind on open water, the flecks of overlapping planks beneath your boots, the scrape of ice across deckboards, the low murmur of stories beneath a sagging sail, the shared breath of sleeping bodies pressed close for warmth. It's widely recognized that Viking expansion across the North Atlantic reshaped entire regions, carrying language, law, and livelihood across formidable seas. Yet beneath that grand narrative lies something simpler and more intimate. Endurance. You did not survive because of hidden stoves or clever insulation tucked beneath planks. There were no iron heaters glowing below deck, no sealed cabins trapping warmth. The longship remained open to sky and spray. You survived because you understood how to work with what you had. Wool layered carefully against skin. Cloaks adjusted to balance ventilation and insulation. Food chosen for fuel as much as taste. Water rationed thoughtfully. Movement embraced as a generator of heat rather than a drain. There is an ongoing scholarly conversation about whether winter voyages were common practice or exceptional undertakings shaped by unusual circumstances. Some argue that necessity pushed sailors into harsher seasons than ideal. Others believe most long crossings were planned for milder months. The truth likely shifts with time and place. What does not shift is the reality of cold wind against exposed faces. A small yet telling detail preserved in saga tradition speaks of men measuring one another not only by feats of battle but by resilience in hardship. Whether fully accurate or slightly embellished, that emphasis on shared endurance rings true. You recall how leadership manifested not through comfort but through example, how repairs were made with numb fingers, how watch shifts guarded sleeping comrades against unseen threats. Without heating, the ship itself demanded cooperation. No one could retreat into private warmth. Status dissolved under frost. Researchers who analyze early maritime societies often note that community cohesion becomes most visible under stress. Winter voyages stripped away illusion. What remained was trust, discipline, and mutual reliance. You walk slowly along the hull now, resting on shore. Your gloved hand traces the curve of timber that carried you through storm and ice. The lessons of the journey settle softly. Warmth is not only flame, it is friction of oar against water. It is shoulder pressed to shoulder. It is food shared without resentment. It is story whispered into just dark. The sea did not grow kinder, the wind did not moderate out of sympathy, yet you endured. And so the broader story of Viking seafaring becomes less about spectacle and more about the method. Clinker-built planks flexed rather than fractured. Shallow draughts allowed refuge in narrow inlets. Sailcloth doubled as shelter. Tar-sealed seams against intrusion. Each detail small on its own, together decisive. As twilight deepens across snow and water, you feel a quiet pride not in conquest but in comprehension. You learn to read sky and swell, to sense moisture before it froze, to listen for subtle knocks within hull planks, to generate heat through rhythm and restraint. Without heating systems, without enclosed decks, survival required awareness that never quite slept. You look toward the fjord where smoke rises steadily from hearths. Fire waits on land dependable and contained, but at sea warmth lived within you, within your crew, within design refined over generations. The winter voyage becomes not a reckless gamble, but a testament to preparation. And as you step back from the longships, snow crunching softly beneath your boots, you realize something that lingers beyond cold and fatigue. The truest source of heat was never hidden in metal or stone. It was carried in breath, in muscle, in companionship. You close your eyes, briefly letting that understanding settle like falling snow. The sea may freeze at its edges, the wind may carve lines into skin, yet human warmth carefully guarded and generously shared crosses even the most brutal winter waters. Now let the image soften. The longship rests quietly against white shore. The fjord reflects a pale moon. The wind has gentled to a whisper. You draw your cloak closer, not from urgency, but from habit. Your breath rises once, twice, then fades into the still night air. And in that calm you allow the journey to drift gently away like a ship receding toward the horizon. You are warm enough. You are home. Sweet dreams, screams.